Hello everyone, my name is Citizen Kryes, and welcome to the Political Ideologies Iceberg. Now, if you don't know what an iceberg is, you start at the top with the most well-known stuff, and then as you go down the iceberg, further down the layers, you get to more obscure stuff that's lesser known. I made this iceberg myself, and basically my goal here is to just give a basic overview of all of these ideologies. This video isn't a replacement for just actually going out and researching for yourself, but I do hope at the very least I can give you some kind of idea as to what all of these ideologies stand for. It's also important to note for these ideologies that people's own interpretations can change. Like, I'm going off the strictest definition of what these all stand for, but from person to person it can vary, and I'm just going to go off the most orthodox, widely accepted definition of the word. So yeah, let's dive into this with layer 1. Democracy. Now, democracy is probably the system you're living under if you're watching this video, and it basically means that citizens are allowed to elect representatives to their government, and it's basically a way of allowing people to have a say in how the government is ran. Now, the way democracy functions can vary from country to country. Some countries use proportional representation, which is where the percentage of the vote that you get reflects your seats. So for example, if you won 25% of the vote, you would win 25% of seats. Some countries have first past the post, which is about electing local representatives, and it's more of a sort of winner takes all kind of thing, where even if a candidate wins like 35% of the vote, if all the other candidates win less than that, they win the entire seat regardless. But at the end of the day, what democracy stands for ultimately, regardless of what the system is basically just allowing people's voices to be heard within government, at least in theory. Authoritarianism. Now, authoritarianism is, well, the opposite of democracy. It's any system of government which doesn't allow for elections or doesn't allow for citizens to actually take part in government themselves. You can have certain democracies be qualified as authoritarian. For example, there are certain countries where elections are held, but they're just unfair, so they're still considered authoritarian even though they technically are democracies. Russia's probably the prime example of this. They do hold elections and people can theoretically vote for whoever they want to, but there are certain advantages given to the ruling party, or there are certain things that are done to the ballot afterwards that make the country authoritarian. I'll be exploring a few more specifics later on in the iceberg, but ultimately all you gotta know is anything that's authoritarian is anti-democratic. Left-wing/right-wing. Now, the origins of the term left-wing and right-wing actually originate from the French Revolution, and specifically the Revolutionary National Assembly, where those who were considered generally more conservative in their views would sit on the right side, and those who were considered more progressive and radical would sit on the left side. So yeah, just in case you were wondering where those names actually came from, it's from that. To broadly oversimplify right-wing and left-wing, right-wing ideologies are generally more conservative, and left-wing ideologies are generally more progressive. And we will get into what conservative and progressive really mean as we go down the iceberg. But no, as a general rule, when people talk about right-wing stuff, they mean something that is conservative, and when they talk about something that's left-wing, they're talking about something that's socialist or liberal, even though there is a great amount of debate over whether liberalism is more of a centrist ideology, because although it's certainly left-wing on social issues, it isn't as left-wing in terms of economic issues, but we'll talk about it as we go down the iceberg. Capitalism. Now, capitalism is the predominant economic system across the world, and basically capitalism advocates for private ownership of the means of production. Now, I think a lot of people end up confusing capitalism with just the idea of having a market economy, but that isn't the same thing. Capitalism isn't the only economic system where people exchange goods or use money. It's just the one that prioritizes having those transactions be deregulated and be through private enterprise. And private ownership is basically anything that isn't owned by the government. So as you can probably tell, that's a pretty wide net that's being cast. So that can be something an individual owns, that can be something a small business owns, that can be something a giant media conglomerate owns. It basically just advocates for more industries to be privately owned and ran for profit, as well as just free market ideals generally speaking. Socialism. Now, socialism is the opposite of capitalism in that it believes in the public ownership of the means of production. Public ownership is basically anything owned by the state and intended for other people to use. The main things under public ownership within our societies are usually healthcare, the military, police, fire brigades, public transportation, the energy sector, certain aspects of housing. It can vary from country to country, but generally speaking, you do have something in your country that is probably publicly owned. Socialism in its most orthodox and basic understanding is just advocating for more things to be publicly owned. If you want to use a more broad term for the word socialism though, it's basically just the idea of doing things for the collective good of the community, as well as more broadly advocating for things like a welfare state, which is basically the idea of just having a vast social security net, whether that's through pensions, disability benefits, unemployment benefits. Anything that can be considered something to fall back on financially is considered part of the welfare state, specifically things that are government owned. Communism. Now, communism is similar to socialism in the way that they both advocate for public ownership. Communism takes things a step further by declaring that all things should be owned publicly, and that society should transition away from a class-based society into a classless one. What this would basically mean is there would be no hierarchies, with everyone within society being considered on an equal level. We'll explore what exactly we think of as communism later down in the Iceberg, but for all intensive purposes, a lot of the communist states that we saw in the past and even nowadays are generally seen as transitional states, or at least that's how they like to view themselves as. They haven't fully committed to a communist economy yet because they're just in the transitioning process. Also, once again, I will say that this is a very broad and basic outline of communism. There are so many sub-ideologies and different interpretations, and we will get into some of those as the Iceberg goes on, but in its base form, communism is just the idea of a classless society where everything is publicly owned and the needy are taken care of. Liberalism. Liberalism is basically the belief in individuality and freedom as being the most important things within a society. Liberals believe in a free market capitalist economy, and generally speaking try to limit the amount of influence the state has. Liberalism, much like socialism and many other ideologies, has its sub-ideologies, and we will get into those. But in a broader sense, liberalism stands for a more open economy as well as a more open society. I think it's important to say here as well that liberalism and socialism are obviously not the same thing. This isn't really an issue in other countries, but in America specifically, I think a lot of people mix up liberalism and socialism. It is true that both ideologies believe in socially progressive ideas, but the attitudes to achieving those goals are different. As an example, let's say that some people within a group have started to come down with some kind of sickness. Socialists would suggest that the most well-off person within the group should redistribute some of their resources in order to help those people out, even if the person with the most resources isn't necessarily in support of that. In comparison, a liberal would say that if that person doesn't want to redistribute their resources, then they shouldn't have to, and that the people with this illness should figure out how to deal with it themselves. And in simplified terms, that really is the ideological debate between socialism and liberalism. In certain cases, should the needs of the community be put above the needs and freedoms of an individual? Or should individual freedoms be put above this? Now, the debate isn't always this binary, and there is a lot of overlap between the two groups, but those core disagreements on certain policy ideas are why the two are separated from each other, despite the fact that they both support socially progressive policies. Conservatism. Conservatism is an ideology that espouses keeping traditions and maintaining order. What this generally manifests itself as is pro-establishment views. Conservatives believe in maintaining what we already have, and are generally opposed to a lot of changes within government and within the economy. This also obviously leads to generally conservatives being more, well, conservative on social views, because most countries were traditionally socially conservative in terms of their political values, so conservatives tend to stick to that. But when it comes to economics, this can actually vary a bit. For example, if a country does actually have a left-wing history of economics, then conservatives should support left-wing economics because it's part of the country's history and traditions. But the vast majority of conservative movements are capitalist, because the vast majority of countries were either historically or are currently capitalist. So as a general rule, basically expect conservatism to be liberalism, but with conservative social values, where individual freedom is okay so long as it doesn't contradict certain traditional values. Before moving on completely, though, I want to give an overview of the main three overarching ideologies: socialism, liberalism, and conservatism. Now, if I had to summarize all three with three of the key values that I feel are important to that ideology, it would go like this. The three core tenets of socialism are equality, fairness, and community. The three core tenets of liberalism are liberty, privacy, and individuality, and the three core tenets of conservatism are tradition, order, and hierarchy. Now, after stating some of those core principles, you might have found yourself gravitating to more than just one under a single banner. And that's the thing about ideology. Although I am going to go through a bunch of classifications for things today, at the end of the day it is a spectrum of belief, and it can sometimes be hard to pigeonhole someone into a specific term or ideological classification. And in a lot of cases you can have multiple core values overlap. Like, you can believe in increased equality but still within a hierarchical system, and you can believe in the rights of privacy whilst also taking into account order. But when it comes to those ideological debates between community and the individual, privacy versus security, and tradition versus equality, you'll eventually find yourself leaning towards one of these core values more than the other. And that is the kind of thing that will determine what exactly your ideology is. But if you're still not fully understanding this all, well, we've got a whole iceberg of stuff to go through, so strap in. Progressivism. Now, progressivism is a very broad term, and I think has basically just become synonymous with liberalism, generally speaking. But progressivism in its base form is basically just the idea of advocating for social change, with that usually manifesting as expanding the rights of minority groups, or improving the economic conditions of the working class. It's a very broad term, and in a lot of places it means a lot of different things. Nowadays, though, progressivism is basically just seen as an umbrella term for any sort of left-wing or liberal social change. Like whether you're advocating for expanding trans rights or advocating for expansions in the minimum wage, it can largely be considered a progressive reform. Feminism. Feminism is a political ideology that advocates for equal rights for women, as well as disproving cultural stereotypes about women. Feminism can be a broader movement than just focusing on women, though. Specifically, the men's liberation movement within feminism speaks about how men are also negatively affected by gender roles, with gender roles specifically being what society expects men and women to do. For example, a traditional gender role for a woman would be to stay at home and cook and clean, and for the man it would be to be the main income bringer into the household and to be traditionally masculine. The thing is, though, feminists aren't necessarily against this dynamic in particular, just the idea of it being forced upon people who don't necessarily fit into that mold. Now, if someone does want to look for an alternative to that traditional power dynamic and lifestyle, they should be able to. And likewise, if a traditional relationship works for a couple and they are happy in that relationship, then there's no issue there, so long as both people remain satisfied and happy in those roles, and that people who do deviate from that traditional lifestyle are treated with respect. Feminism came in different waves as its ideology progressed throughout the years, with first wave feminism originating in the 1800s and specifically focusing on voting rights, as well as property ownership. Second wave feminism, which originated in the 1960s and focused on equal pay, domestic abuse prevention, as well as abortion access. Third wave feminism focused on individual gender empowerment, sex positivity, as well as more generally embracing diversity as a whole. And fourth wave feminism originating in the 2010s, which focused on reinforcing and protecting the gains that had been made, as well as promoting a change in gender stereotypes. I think an easy way to distinguish between the different types of movements is specifically the first and second one being focused on political equality, and the third and fourth wave focusing on cultural equality. Don't get me wrong though, feminism is a very complex and large movement, and I haven't even gotten into certain divisions within the feminist community, with many different people having many different theories on how gender inequality can be solved. Socialist feminism and Marxist feminism, for example, argue that capitalism is the thing that reinforces gender roles. Anarcho-feminism believes that as long as a state exists, patriarchy exists, thus it embraces anarchism as a political ideology. There's liberal feminism, which believes that gender equality can be achieved in the current system, and specifically within a capitalist system. There are more conservative movements within feminism, specifically trans-exclusionary radical feminism, which is against transgender women being a part of feminism. And that's just a few of the many branches of feminism that I won't be able to cover in this video just because there are so many. But as a whole, broad definition of the term, feminism basically just advocates for the economic, political, and cultural equality of the genders. Environmentalism. Environmentalism is pretty much what it says on the tin. It advocates for the protection of the environment and the preservation of nature, as well as more generally the rights of animals. Environmentalism is a pretty big umbrella term and a pretty wide definition, so it isn't really a surprise that there are a lot of sub-ideologies within environmentalism. You have green liberalism, which believes that there's a way for the environment and for capitalism to coexist. You have eco-socialism, which believes that the environment and capitalism can't coexist, so a socialist system needs to be put in place in order to protect the environment. And you have green conservatism, which believes in protecting the environment because of its importance to national pride and cultural heritage. It's a wide-ranging movement, and there's a big difference between recycling and just stop oil protesters, and a lot of varying ideas on how exactly a more eco-friendly world can be achieved. Fascism. Fascism is an authoritarian, ultra-nationalist ideology that believes in uniting the country around a strong military leader. The leaders themselves don't always have to be military men, but the military itself plays a massive role within a fascist society. Under a fascist society, the state is prioritized over anything else. Both individual rights and the collective good are sidelined in favor of loyalty to the state. Fascism also seeks to create a united national identity, and this usually manifests itself as being against multiculturalism, and more often than not believes in a strict racial or cultural hierarchy. In terms of economics, fascism is corporatist, and that is an ideology that we will explore as we go down the iceberg. And fascism is unique in that it is both anti-capitalist and anti-socialist. Despite advocating for state ownership in a lot of places, that state ownership isn't undertaken for the collective good. It's undertaken in order for the state to have much more control over the lives of its people. And even when fascism does allow for a certain amount of private ownership, that private ownership still needs to adhere to the state, and is usually restricted to whoever the state sees as being worthy of that private ownership, whether that's a certain race or gender or economic class, with this violence, discrimination, and oppression being inseparable from the core tenets of fascism. Nazism. Nazism, or National Socialism, was the official ideology of Nazi Germany, which ruled Germany from 1933 to 1945. In terms of the whole socialism aspect of National Socialism, most people seem to be in agreement that it's mostly a marketing thing, since Germany had been under a number of conservative capitalist governments prior to the Nazis coming to power, so them using the word socialism was essentially a way for them to distance themselves from those conservative establishment figures, even if they would go on to collaborate with a number of those establishment figures, and would go on to oppress trade union movements and socialists in general. Judging it by its actual policy though, Nazism is essentially the most extreme form of fascism possible, with its core principles essentially being to wipe out ethnically inferior races, and to establish a global empire led by the Aryan race. This would eventually lead Germany to becoming increasingly expansionist, and would eventually end up leading to them invading Poland and starting World War II, and on top of that they also perpetrated what is known as the Holocaust, which was the mass extermination of these lesser ethnic groups. The main groups that they targeted were Jews, Romanis, Slavs, and the physically or mentally disabled. They did this by creating death camps in which people were murdered en masse, and where an efficient machine of genocide was created in order to achieve these goals, with an estimated 16 to 17 million people killed during this time, excluding deaths in combat. Outside of the straight-up extermination of these people, there was also widespread torture, rape, slavery, and even experimentation, in which Nazi scientists were essentially given free rein to do whatever they wanted to do, leading to some of the worst atrocities in human history. There is a little bit more to go into Nazism, but I think the most important thing here is just to emphasize how genocidal and violent it really was, and how important it is to never forget what happened, and just to emphasize the sheer scale of the suffering, and how regardless of your political leanings, that it's an abhorrent, vile, and evil ideology, and that any other ideologies that I talk about today that condone this kind of genocide and violence are ones that I am not endorsing. This video is simply for educational purposes, and that genocide, regardless of who's perpetrating it, is categorically wrong, and there should absolutely be no exceptions to that. Imperialism. Imperialism is basically any forceful expansion of territory. So whenever a country goes to war in order to expand its borders or influence, that could be considered imperialism. I think imperialism generally is probably most associated with colonialism, which is when a country colonizes another country. Colonization basically just means another country sets up shop in another country. Usually this is done by establishing a client state. For example, in India you had the British Raj, which, although technically being its own little country, was owned and ran by the British government. Now, it's important to note that expanding your borders isn't necessarily imperialist. It only becomes imperialism when it's done without the consent of the other party. For example, if two countries just voted to join together and become one country, that wouldn't be imperialism because they both consented to it. But if one country rejected that proposition and the other country invaded, that would then be considered imperialism. And the vast majority of what we consider to be colonialism was done without the consent of the people living there. Whether it's Manifest Destiny or the colonization of India or the scramble for Africa, in 99% of cases, natives were either tricked into unfriendly deals, tricked into fighting one another in order to weaken the entire nation as a whole, or just straight up militarily conquered. This happened during most colonial empires, and it could all be considered some form of imperialism. Anarchism. Now, anarchism is a very difficult ideology to explain. I think when most people think of anarchism, they usually just think of, well, anarchy and chaos, but that's more of the general way of looking at anarchism. But the actual political ideology of anarchism is a bit different. Anarchism advocates for a stateless society in which everybody contributes things voluntarily, so nothing you do would be done against your will. For example, tax or getting arrested, because that would be done against your will. Everything you do would be because you've done it voluntarily. Now that is, like I've said before, a very broad overview of anarchism. There are hundreds of different sub-ideologies of anarchism, and I could have easily just made an iceberg purely about the different anarchism sub-ideologies, but there are so many that I didn't want to just fill up the iceberg with them, so I will talk about a few here. You have anarcho-communism, which is basically just anarchism, but there are certain things that are collectively owned. For example, there is a stateless society, but in certain cases when people really need help, there would be a case for people to collectively come together and help that person. Whereas in a regular anarchist society, if that person needed help, they would have to rely on who's willing to volunteer, as opposed to anarcho-communism, which would say that the group would, in this case, all come together to help that person. You have anarcho-capitalism, which is basically just the idea of having no regulations whatsoever for business. This means everything would be under private ownership, with zero government oversight and zero protections for workers or established minimum wages. You also have anarcho-primitivism, which basically advocates for humanity to return to a prehistoric society, where we would abandon technology and deindustrialize. So as you can probably tell, it is a very diverse range of ideas and beliefs, and it's why that I'm not really going to go into anarchist ideology as we go down this iceberg. I think if anything, anarchism would deserve an iceberg of its own. But yeah, just the basic idea of anarchism is a stateless society where nothing is done against you. Everything you do would be done voluntarily and with your consent. Social democracy. Social democracy is a left-wing ideology that's prominent throughout all of Europe, and basically advocates for a merging of capitalist and socialist policies. In order for a capitalist free market system to work, there has to be certain limitations put upon it, and that injecting socialism into capitalism can create a more fair and equitable society. For example, under social democracy, even though a majority of things would be privately owned, certain things would be under public ownership. This would include the usual stuff like the police or the military or healthcare, but could also expand to education, energy, public transportation, or any other number of key industries. This is done in order to offset the potential harms of capitalism. For example, if under a capitalist system a worker is laid off unjustly, they can fall back on the socialist policies. And in the event of a company going under, that company can be nationalized in order to save jobs. Nationalization is basically just when something is taken under government ownership, by the way. Certain things might be put under public ownership as well for the sake of convenience. For example, under public ownership, public transportation would be handled by a central authority that could coordinate all the organs of that public transportation system. And with the collective good in mind as opposed to profit, that would, in theory, provide a better service. Certain businesses and industries could be nationalized for profit, though, by the government. For example, if a government wished to fund certain things but they didn't want to raise taxes any further, they could nationalize the steel industry or the coal industry or the energy industry and open up a new source of revenue outside of tax. There is quite a bit of debate within social democracy, though, on how far to go with public ownership. Like, generally speaking, before the 80s, social democrats were generally more in favor of public ownership, but nowadays it's sort of petered off. Like, social democrats generally do tend to agree on things like healthcare and education being publicly owned and free, but outside of that, it gets a little bit murky, and there's more debate on what and what shouldn't be privately or publicly owned. Social democracy is probably also best known as the Nordic model. Although there are slight differences between the Nordic model and social democracy, they are, for the purposes of this and for the purposes of a basic overview, pretty much the same. They both believe in mixing elements of socialism and capitalism in order to create a balanced society. Generally speaking, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party can be considered social democratic. Bernie Sanders is probably the most prominent social democrat in American politics, although he does identify himself as a democratic socialist, even though that's not necessarily true. But like I said in the beginning, people have different meanings for different things, and for a lot of people, democratic socialism has just become a term to advocate for authentic social democracy, as some see that current social democrats have begun to lean too much into capitalism. Social democrats are also progressive in terms of social issues, although I think in Romania and Slovakia, their social democratic parties are actually a little bit more conservative, and I believe the same can be said for the Danish social democrats, although to a lesser extent. But yeah, to round it off, social democracy is the idea of combining capitalism and socialism and trying to find a perfect in-between between the two. Paternalistic conservatism. Paternalistic conservatism has its origins in Otto von Bismarck, who, despite being anti-socialist and anti-liberal, was very adamant about having welfare programs for the German people. In fact, Germany during that time period could probably be considered one of the earliest examples of a welfare state. There was health insurance, workplace compensation, disability insurance, and old age retirement pensions, none of which had really existed to the extent that it did when it was first introduced here in Germany. Bismarck adopted a lot of these socialist policies and welfare ideas because he believed that it was the only way for conservatives to compete with the growing liberal and socialist movements within Europe. Specifically, he hoped to counter the growth of the Social Democratic Party that was growing in Germany at the time. Paternalistic conservatism is basically the conservative counterpart to social democracy. In terms of economics, they are fairly similar, although paternalistic conservatives do tend to lean a little bit more capitalist, but the differences start to appear when it comes to social issues. Paternalistic conservatives tend to be more conservative conservative on immigration and are generally more in favor of traditional values. This can vary quite a bit though, and a lot of paternalistic conservatives are also kind of moderate on social issues. It's a pretty wide spectrum of beliefs, but generally speaking, you're safe in assuming that paternalistic conservatism is just the conservative version of social democracy. Paternalistic conservatism does also go by the name progressive conservatism, and I know that seems sort of counterintuitive, but it's based on the same idea of taking progressive left-leaning politics and economics and putting it into a conservative overall ideology. Religious democracy. Now, religious democracy, or as it's called, Christian democracy or Islamic democracy or Buddhist democracy, depending on the country, is much like paternalistic conservatism in that it is the conservative counterpart to social democracy. Except unlike paternalistic conservatism, religious democracy focuses more on religion. Similarly to paternalistic conservatism, it can almost be considered a centrist ideology because it's center-left economically and center-right socially, but the way that the left-right spectrum works, they usually get put in the center. But from religious Democrat to religious Democrat, how right-wing they are on social issues and how left-wing they are on economic issues can change. But as a general rule, and especially in Europe, religious Democrats are seen as being part of the moderate right-wing, and generally more in favor of coalition or collaboration with liberal parties, or even in the case of the Grand Coalition in Germany, social democratic parties. Liberal conservatism. Liberal conservatism is a centre-right political ideology and the main ideology of most of the European moderate right. It's an ideology that combines elements of liberalism and conservatism, with this mainly relating to economic and social policy. On the social policy side of things, liberal conservatives may be slightly more liberal on immigration, although still in the conservative camp. And then on economic policy, liberal conservatives are generally firmly capitalist, and are more in favour of free trade, and in Europe, more in favour of the EU. Liberal conservatism has mostly overthrown paternalistic conservatism, and religious democracy is the main strand of conservatism in Europe, at least on the moderate side of things, although its influence in recent years has begun to wane, as more often than not people just want full conservatism or full liberalism. Classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is essentially advocating for the most orthodox understanding of liberalism and rejects a lot of the revisions that have happened to liberalism as it's progressed as an ideology. So as you can guess, that means it's pretty solidly committed to capitalism, free enterprise, and the free market, and a pretty staunch defender of capitalism, as well as individualism, and overall a focus on the idea of freedom, whether that's freedom in the economy, freedom in society, or freedom in trade, as well as liberal values. Social liberalism. Social liberalism is widely considered the most left-wing that a liberal ideology can get. It sticks to the core principles of liberalism, but adds in some market regulation and some welfare programs to kind of moderate things a bit. It still doesn't lean into these welfare programs enough to be considered a socialist or left-wing ideology like social democracy or democratic socialism. It's very similar to the liberalism versus socialism little argument I did earlier on in the video, but unlike classical liberalism, it doesn't completely shy away from certain socialist ideas, but once again it still is overall firmly in the liberal camp of ideology. Conservative liberalism. Now, I know you're probably thinking that we just covered this, but conservative liberalism is different from liberal conservatism. I initially thought that liberal conservatism would be the more conservative variant between the two, but it's actually conservative liberalism, which is generally seen as being more conservative overall. And specifically, that's because conservative liberalism is more inspired by classical liberalism, whereas liberal conservatism is more inspired by modern forms of liberalism. Meaning, on a whole, conservative liberals are generally even more capitalist than liberal conservatives, but also tend to combine that with more socially conservative values. Once again, there is variation here, but just to finalize the distinctions between the two, liberal conservatism embraces classical liberalism and moderate conservatism, and conservative liberalism embraces classical liberalism even more, and embraces even more conservative values. So conservative liberalism is pretty much just liberal conservatism but pushed further, both on the liberal economic front and the conservative values front. Libertarianism. Libertarianism is basically classical liberalism but taken even further. Libertarianism advocates for the least amount of government you can have without basically being an anarchic state. The same thing applies to things like regulations, the free market, and private ownership as well. Basically the bridge between classical liberalism and anarcho-capitalism. And it is important to note that it is in fact a liberal ideology, because the goal of libertarianism is to maximize the individual rights of someone as much as possible. So limiting those rights with conservative social stances would be going against that. Now, there is specifically a conservative offshoot of libertarianism, specifically conservative libertarianism, but back to standard libertarianism, it is essentially just the furthest you can get within the liberal spectrum without delving into just straight up full anarchy. Populism. Populism is a pretty broad term and is basically used to describe any sort of movement or ideology which advocates for a change from the establishment. Now, populism is both a left-wing and right-wing ideology, with left-wing populists focusing on things like capitalism, as well as more broadly just the conservative establishment, whereas right-wing populism is a little bit harder to define. It essentially believes in overthrowing the liberal establishment, and that isn't necessarily in an economic way and more so in a social way, with right-wing populists generally being against socially progressive stances, with the most notable and prominent movement coming from right-wing populism probably being the MAGA crowd, as well as more broadly the whole idea of being anti-woke. So yeah, populism is a pretty broad term, and it's less of a political ideology and more of a political style, in the sense that numerous politicians during election seasons will embrace some form of populism, but then when they actually get into power, it's a little bit more debatable whether or not they actually act on those populist promises. But by and large, populism is basically just the idea of advocating for the people and fighting against the establishment elites, whether they're capitalists, conservatives, liberals, or whatever else. Democratic socialism. Democratic socialism in its most base form is just advocating for a socialist system which is also democratic. But as I've talked about previously, democratic socialism as a term has just become more of a broad umbrella term for more left-wing leaning ideologies. Most democratic socialists who call themselves democratic socialists don't really want to just institute a full-on socialist system that happens to be democratic. They usually just end up believing in implementing certain socialist policies within a democratic system. So yeah, just so you know, when people talk about democratic socialism, they don't really mean the orthodox meaning of the word. It just means they believe in democracy and certain elements of socialism. Marxism. Marxism is the term used to describe the thoughts and political beliefs of Karl Marx, the original writer of the Communist Manifesto, as well as a few other books that talk about class. And that's the thing about Marxism, is that it's more than just a political ideology, it's also a philosophical ideology. But if we examine it purely as a political ideology, Marxism is basically just advocating for an orthodox form of communism. It wants to adhere to the original communist vision that Marx set out as closely as possible. And even though that is kind of true politically speaking, Marxism isn't just that. It's also more broadly a critique of capitalism, and specifically class structure. And even if you study something like criminology or philosophy or sociology, some kind of Marxist theory will come up in it. Because like I said, it has transcended beyond communism, and has become more of a broad critique of capitalism as a whole. Although it can still be used to just describe sticking to communism orthodoxly if you wish to. Marxism-Leninism. Marxism-Leninism is probably the most well-known form of communism. It was the official party line of the Soviet Union and is pretty much what every modern communist state claims to adhere to. Marxism-Leninism pretty much advocates for the same things that communism does, states that in order to achieve those goals, a one-party state needs to be established. What this basically means is there would be one sole political party that would ideally represent all of the workers, and then over the course of however long it may be, the economy and society would slowly transition to a communist one. Now, it's safe to say that none of the Marxist-Leninist countries ever fully transitioned to communism, but Marxist-Leninism on its own is basically just the idea of, we can establish communism, but in order to do so, we need to establish a transitional period in which the state has full control. In their view, this is the best way to transition society as quickly and efficiently as possible to a communist one. Oligarchy. Oligarchy, meaning rule of the few in Greek, is any form of government where a small group of people control the country, and where democracy isn't permitted or is incredibly flawed. An oligarchy is different from something like a dictatorship, because in a dictatorship, one person has supreme rule, whereas in an oligarchy, that supreme power is divided amongst a small group of people. Oligarch has also just become a term to describe someone who is wealthy and influential in politics. Like, you could argue that Rupert Murdoch is an oligarch because of how much sway he has over public opinion. For those of you who don't know, Rupert Murdoch was the CEO of Fox News and Sky News, and also had influence over some local papers like The Sun in the UK, the Daily Telegraph in Australia, and the Wall Street Journal in the United States. But that is more of a broad definition of the term, and all you really need to know for the purposes of this video is that an oligarchy is any sort of government where multiple people rule but aren't elected. And unlike a dictatorship, it isn't ruled by a single person with supreme power but multiple people with supreme power. Nationalism. Nationalism initially was basically just the idea of advocating for your own country's interests, and depending on the country it could also act as an independence movement, like the Scottish nationalists in the UK, or the Catalan nationalists in Spain. But nationalism has kind of moved away from that definition. It is still used for that, but now nationalism can be used as a more broad term. A broad term that is used to describe a wide-ranging set of beliefs, but more specifically, it's basically the idea of your own culture being superior to others, or advocating for your culture to be the sole culture of a certain country. Nationalism differs from patriotism, as patriotism is just love for one's country, and that doesn't necessarily mean you think it's objectively superior to another culture or another country, but nationalism is explicit in how it believes that its own culture and values are better than other countries. There is some room here though, and there are some nationalists who are a lot more moderate, but generally speaking, nationalism can be seen as being against multiculturalism, which is basically the idea of different cultures, people, and religions being able to coexist. And there are also more extreme variants of nationalism as well, such as ethnic or religious nationalism, which essentially either say that somebody's race is superior to someone else's, or somebody's religion is superior to someone else's, and thus they believe in preserving that race or religion or getting rid of other races or religions. But the original kind of broad term about basically just advocating for independence or advocating for some kind of representation for your nationality is still used in parts of the world. And it's important to do your own research and distinguish between independence movements or regionalist movements and culturally nationalist movements. Internationalism. Internationalism, also known as globalism, is basically the idea that countries from around the world should work together. In that sense, internationalism is essentially the complete opposite of nationalism. Where nationalism advocates for a specific group within a specific country, internationalism advocates for multiple groups within multiple countries. And unlike nationalism, is generally in favor of things like multiculturalism. Isolationism. Although nationalism is the opposite of internationalism, isolationism could also be considered the opposite of internationalism. As the name suggests, isolationism advocates for countries to be self-sufficient and not to reach out to other countries. Isolationism isn't inherently a left-wing or right-wing ideology. In the same way that internationalism isn't inherently right-wing or left-wing, we will talk about an isolationist left-wing ideology as we go down the iceberg. But as a very general rule, isolationists are generally speaking more right-wing, and internationalists are generally more liberal or left-wing. Euroscepticism. Still sticking to isolationism, Euroscepticism is specifically a European branch of isolationism, and in particular relates to the European Union and how certain people are skeptical of it. The range of Euroscepticism can vary because you have soft Euroscepticism and hard Euroscepticism. Soft Euroscepticism is still probably pro-EU overall, but has certain critiques and reservations about the European Union as a whole, and is more likely to support reforms of the European Union rather than just leaving it outright. Whereas hard Euroscepticism is firmly against the European Union, and either advocates for a specific country to leave the European Union, or advocates for the European Union as a whole to no longer exist. Euroscepticism is generally associated with the right wing of politics, but there are certain left-wing political parties within Europe that are soft Eurosceptics, and they usually concern themselves with issues of trade or worker protection, but it is generally more often than not a right-wing movement. But it can also manifest as a libertarian movement, specifically against the regulations that the EU puts on certain businesses. But regardless of the ideology, if there's any sort of skepticism towards the European Union as an organization, it could be classified as Euroscepticism. Reactionaryism. Reactionaryism is a conservative ideology that is to the right of regular conservatism, and rather than conservatism which proposes to maintain certain traditions, reactionaryism proposes to restore certain traditions. Let's say that a referendum on abortion is held throughout a country and then the pro-abortion side wins. Although a conservative may have backed the anti-abortion stance, conservatives wouldn't go so far as to actively campaign for that to be reversed. They would just campaign against its expansion. But reactionaries would actively campaign to have that repeal, and to have an even stricter conservative policy put in place. Reactionaryism generally goes hand in hand with religious nationalism and right-wing populism, and can generally be considered the most hardline conservative ideology that's still within the political mainstream. And once again, just to reiterate the difference between conservatism and reactionaryism, conservatism is maintaining tradition, and reactionaryism is restoring tradition. Centrism. Centrism is a political ideology that pretty much does what it says on the tin. Centrism is a political ideology that advocates for neither left-wing or right-wing policies, or at the very least advocates for a balance of left-wing and right-wing policies to be introduced. Now, hearing that, you'd probably expect centrism to be something like 50% socialism, 50% capitalism, but generally speaking, that really isn't the case, and centrism is much more similar to social liberalism. It is incredibly difficult to maintain a centrist ideology, because any route you take in terms of economics or social policy could be considered going one way or the other. So as a general rule, centrism will either lean more towards conservatism or liberalism as it goes on. So to recap, centrism is basically just the idea of combining elements of liberalism and conservatism within a capitalist system. And more often than not, socialism is either ignored entirely or implemented very slightly. Zionism. Zionism was spawned from the 19th century and is a nationalist movement that proclaims that the Jewish people should have a homeland in Palestine. And this is because Jerusalem and Palestine and that entire area is a very important part of Jewish religion. And it grew massively in support after the atrocities of World War II when Jewish people were trying to find a home outside of Europe. Now, Zionism on its own isn't necessarily an endorsement of the Israeli state. You can still believe that Israel has a right to exist and criticize the government's actions, but likewise, being against Zionism doesn't make you an anti-Semite, anti-Semitism obviously being the hatred of Jews. In fact, there are many Jewish groups that are against the Zionist movement as a whole. The whole Israel-Palestine conflict in Zionism as a whole is beyond the scope of this video, but just know when people talk about Zionism and Zionists, they're referring to someone who's in support of Israel as a concept. And although not necessarily in support of the Israeli government, more often than not they end up being. Keynesianism. Keynesianism is a term used to describe John Maynard Keynes and his beliefs when it came to economics. Keynes believed that the current market system, which was prevalent throughout most of the world in the 1800s and early 1900s, was flawed, and that more action from central banks and the government was needed in order to make the system more secure. And his policy really came into shape in the aftermath of the Great Depression, when the flaws of an unregulated market economy became apparent, at least in his opinion. So what Keynes proposed in order to essentially save the market economy was higher investment into businesses and infrastructure, lower costs for products or higher wages for workers so that more things are being bought, and a commitment to maintaining full employment as much as possible. Although starting off in the aftermath of the Great Depression, Keynesianism really kicked off after World War II, when after numerous countries were left in rubble, the idea of spending in the economy and spending to rebuild the country was seen as attractive. In fact, the period from 1945 to 1973 is often called the golden age of capitalism. It was considered an era where the system was at its most stable, the amount of things the average person could buy and afford were higher, and the needs of workers, consumers, and businesses were balanced. However, around the time of the 70s, inflation became a bit of a problem, and this combined with the oil crisis in 1973 and another oil crisis in 1979 led to Keynesianism as an ideology petering out in favor of a successor, which we will talk about next. And really, ever since the 80s, Keynesianism has kind of phased out as the primary economic model. After the financial crisis in 2008, it started to get picked up again, as many saw the parallels between the Great Depression and the Great Recession, but it's still, as of right now, not the main economic model of most countries on the planet, and has since been usurped by neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an economic model which basically argues for the revival of classic liberal economics, and specifically it criticizes Keynesian economics as not prioritizing keeping inflation low enough, and is generally against higher government spending and higher regulations, with politicians like Reagan in America and Thatcher in Britain further reinforcing it as the economic model. Under a neoliberal system, certain sacrifices are made in terms of government spending in order to keep inflation low. This could mean that wages, social security checks, and pensions could be cut in order to achieve this goal. Neoliberalism also embraces the economic idea of laissez-faire economics. Neoliberalism also embraces the economic idea of laissez-faire, which in French means let do, and it advocates for as little economic intervention as possible. Neoliberalism also went on to influence the Washington Consensus, a set of proposals that advocate for the selling off of state-owned enterprises, the deregulation of the economy, the lowering of taxes, and a decrease in overall government spending. As of right now, neoliberalism is the principal economic system of the planet, and is generally the preferred economic system of most right-wing and liberal parties. Although due to its prominence, it does have influence in certain factions of left-wing parties. Corporatism. Now, from the name corporatism, you may think that this is another capitalist-leaning ideology that favors corporations, but in reality, corporatism actually favors public ownership, and basically states that the economy should be divided up into corporations, which outside of the business meaning of the word basically just means a grouping of people, and that these corporations should be organized by industry, and that these corporations are guided by a central authority that directs them in how the economy should be run. In more simple terms, it's basically the idea of a planned economy, which is where rather than an economy reacting to the market, an economy plans ahead. So basically what this means is, for example, you could have like a potato company company. Under a market system, outside of certain government regulations on health and safety and things like that, the company mostly runs autonomously and can make its own decisions on how the business is run. But under a planned economy, a central governmental authority issues the demands. So for example, the central government authority might say, our data shows us that this many people will need potatoes this year, so because of that, this is how many potatoes you will make. And that isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule, but if you do want to change something, you'll have to get permission from the central governmental authority. And this is basically what corporatism advocates for, and inadvertently, it's basically what people tend to think of when they think of a communist economic system, since corporatism was generally what was considered the in-between between a capitalist and communist society. Corporatism is also a core idea of fascism as well, though, with fascists seeing it as an alternative to the capitalism-communism debate, and often referring to it as the third position. And the whole idea of having a central government agency controlling all of the economy is very much in line with the fascist idea of state control, and the idea of controlling and influencing society. It is important to note, though, that although corporatism advocates for public ownership, publicly owned businesses aren't always run corporately. Like in China, for example, most of the state-owned businesses are run like regular businesses that adhere to the whims of the market, but it can change from place to place. Neoconservatism. Unlike neoliberalism, which is an economic model, neoconservatism is an internationalist model. Neoconservatism kind of spawned from the Cold War, in that although many conservative movements beforehand were traditionally isolationist, as fears of the Soviet Union and communism grew, conservatives generally started having more interventionist stances. This usually manifested itself as sending guns to anti-communist groups, supporting anti-communist political parties, or even directly intervening in conflicts like in the Korean War or the Vietnam War. Neoconservatism persisted as a pretty dominant ideology up until the Iraq War, where more and more conservatives started to become more isolationist. And this attitude also applies to economics, as conservatives traditionally were more isolationist and in favor of protectionism, which proposes raising the price of imports in order to create a more self-reliant country, or at least one that is less reliant on foreign trade, whereas neoconservatism embraced neoliberalism, and is generally in favor of free trade, which importing goods is much cheaper, which protectionists would argue would lead to businesses at home closing down, because if someone can import something from another country that's cheaper, why would they buy locally? Whereas those in support of free trade would say that protectionism limits the options of consumers, since countries might be less likely to give us their products if it costs more to have them imported into the country. But anyway, just to recap all of that, neoconservatism is basically a rejection of the traditional conservative stances on foreign policy and trade, and instead embraces neoliberal free trade as well as intervention overseas. Theocracy. We talked about religious democracy and religious nationalism beforehand, but theocracy is basically that taken to its most extreme point. A theocracy is basically a government which is ruled by religious figures. The most prominent examples of this are probably the Vatican City, which is run by the Catholic Church, and Iran, which is run by Shia Muslim imams. Theocratic nation essentially just implements its religious beliefs into daily government, and a theocracy is essentially what religious nationalists are trying to achieve. A state that bases its principles and laws off of religious scripture. And just like with religious nationalism, which we talked about before, this can manifest in a number of ways, but largely ends up being oppressive to people who don't practice that religion, and also generally speaking, women. Feudalism. Feudalism was the dominant social and economic form of government throughout the Middle Ages, and was basically a system of government where nobility would hold control over a certain area of land, and essentially within that land would hold absolute power. But in exchange for holding that land, they would have to from time to time serve the interests of the crown, who was the only one above them who had the power to take away their power. And the way that the nobility could serve the monarch can vary, but usually would manifest itself as supporting the monarch militarily during a war, paying monetary tribute to the monarch, building a church, castle, or cathedral, or marrying off a relative for diplomatic purposes. And if you were a peasant living in a feudal system, everything you do would be in service of your feudal lord. But this was seen as necessary payment because the nobility would then provide these peasants with protection. Feudalism began to fade out though by the time of the Renaissance, as Enlightenment ideas began to disparage nobility owning people essentially, and the overall powers of the nobility class, the clergy class, and the monarch were reduced. And ever since then, outside of the colonial governments of the European powers, which were very much ran in a feudal style, with the colonial governor essentially having complete control over a certain area, as long as they continued to pay their overlord. But outside of that, feudalism has faded out of the spotlight in terms of being a mainstream political and economic ideology. Left-wing nationalism. Left-wing nationalism is an umbrella term used to describe left-wing ideologies that are generally more isolationist, since most modern left-wing ideologies are generally more internationalist nowadays. But left-wing nationalism is firmly in the isolationist category. Left-wing nationalism doesn't mean you're a nationalist who happens to have certain left-wing beliefs. It's just being left-wing with certain nationalistic characteristics, whilst overall still remaining on the left side of the political spectrum. Religious socialism. Whereas religious democracy seeks to take elements of religion and incorporate them into a social democratic formula, religious socialism seeks to do the same thing but with socialism as a whole, and even argues that their respective religions actually advocate for socialism somewhat. I know specifically with Christianity in particular there's sort of an argument around Jesus being a socialist. I think particularly there's the line from the Bible, I can't remember which verse or whatever, but it goes, "It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven," and there's also just the general take care of the poor attitude. Now, regardless of your own interpretations of that, Christian socialists interpret that as Jesus essentially being a proto-socialist, or essentially saying that if Jesus was alive today, he would be a socialist and he would condemn sort of capitalism and capitalist greed. I'm not as sure about the specifics for Islamic socialism, Jewish socialism, or Buddhist socialism, but I imagine it's a very similar idea. Religious socialism as an ideology is kind of an in-between between the left and the right, and in terms of social issues, it can really vary on what it believes in. Like, certain religious socialists will accept more liberal views on things like abortion and gay marriage, whilst others will stick by the traditional positions on those things whilst also advocating for a socialist economy. It's a broad range of beliefs and ideals, and like I said before, it can vary from person to person. Technocracy. Technocracy basically advocates for a government where, rather than elected officials being part of the government, industry professionals are put in positions of power. So rather than waiting for a scientist, for example, to be elected to a parliament and then put into a position of power, under a technocracy, nobody would be elected to positions of power, they would just be assigned there. People in favor would argue that this would make the government more efficient, but people who argue against it say that this is less democratic. Trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics is the idea that the wealthier that the people on the top get, that wealth will naturally trickle down to everybody else. Proponents of trickle-down economics say that when these people get wealthier and wealthier, they'll eventually start raising wages in accordance with that, and they'll end up donating more things to charity. Trickle-down economics, like I said previously, is very much part of the neoliberal school of thought when it comes to economics, although weirdly it's kind of similar to Keynesianism with how it thinks that spending in an economy is a good thing, but rather than Keynesianism that says that regular people should be spending more in the economy with higher wages and lower costs, it thinks that that should be done with richer people, and that the effects of this will just naturally eventually benefit everybody else. Cooperativism. Cooperativism is an ideology that advocates for worker cooperatives, and a cooperative is essentially just a business that is ran democratically. It's the idea that everybody within the business will have a say in how it's run. Now, unlike socialism, which advocates for cooperativism within a public ownership system, cooperativism isn't necessarily restricted to just public ownership, since cooperativism is also advocated for private businesses as well, and it's more of a broad movement that's specifically just saying that workplace democracy should be more of a thing. Agrarianism. Agrarianism is essentially an ideology that promotes agriculture and rural living, with it emphasizing the importance of local community and generally being more in favor of decentralizing power. It would essentially mean that local governments would have a little bit more power to dictate their own laws. Agrarianism used to just very much be an advocate for farmers' issues, but it's transitioned more into a broad movement which advocates for community and rural living, and is generally considered to be pretty flexible when it comes to the political spectrum, with its support of rural workers as well as its emphasis on the community being very much left-leaning, but its emphasis on often traditional conservative rural values generally being considered right-leaning. But it can shift pretty drastically depending on the party, but it really does depend because it is such a broad movement. Although there is a sub-ideology within agrarianism called agrarian socialism, which advocates for cooperatively owned farms and rural living within a socialist system. But generally speaking, depending on the party, agrarianism is either a center, center-left, or center-right ideology. Alter-globalism. Alter-globalism is a left-wing movement which basically seeks to change the way that globalism works, with many seeing that globalism in its current form is too friendly towards big corporations, and that free trade has been bad for local businesses, workers, and the environment. But unlike isolationist ideologies, which would generally speaking just rather get rid of globalism as a whole, alter-globalism instead advocates for a different form of globalism, one which is more conscious of the environment, one that does allow trade but offers more protections to local workers, and one that promotes democracy in a diplomatic way, with alter-globalists arguing that free trade with countries like Saudi Arabia has actually benefited and reinforced those authoritarian regimes. So ultimately, alter-globalism is essentially still an advocate for globalism, but just wishes to take it into a more fair and just direction, at least in their opinion. African and Arab socialism. Now, I've combined both African and Arab socialism because they are essentially the same thing but for two different regions. Both African and Arab socialism advocate for an anti-colonialist stance, as well as advocating for a united African and Arabian state respectively, with that state being under a socialist or socialist-adjacent system. African and Arab socialism is also very broad in terms of how it achieves those goals. Like, it has the goal of establishing these mega-states with a socialist system, but how each Arab socialist and African socialist leader goes about things can vary, with some people being very much in favor of democracy and others being more authoritarian-leaning. African and Arab socialism were at one point one of the most dominant ideologies in Africa and Arabia, and by Arabia I mean just the wider Middle East. African and Arab socialism began to fall in influence, however, with a bunch of Western-backed coups and assassinations, with the few socialist leaders that did end up surviving having to pivot towards neoliberal economics, or granting significant concessions to Western businesses, or they transitioned more towards fascism. Specifically in the Arab world, the rise of Islamic extremism also hurt socialism, with many socialist leaders being assassinated by Islamic extremists. Despite this, though, African and Arab socialism still remains influential in certain circles. Socialism of the 21st century. Socialism of the 21st century is essentially an ideology that looks back on the socialism of the 20th century and tries to correct the wrongs that were created there. Specifically, socialism of the 21st century criticizes the Soviet model of communism and seeks to embrace a more staunchly democratic form of socialism, and specifically criticizes the authoritarianism of the Soviet Union as a reason why socialism became so stigmatized. Socialism of the 21st century is most prominent in Latin America, where most left-wing parties have embraced some form of socialism of the 21st century. Unlike more centrist-leaning elements of something like social democracy, for example, socialism of the 21st century still firmly rejects neoliberal economics, and because of its prominence in Latin American countries, it's also become a broader advocate for indigenous rights. But for the most part, it's a firmly democratic socialist ideology. Stalinism. Stalinism is a term used to describe the personal philosophy and governmental style of Joseph Stalin, who was the de facto ruler of the Soviet Union from 1924 until 1953 when he died. Stalinism is a subsection of Marxist-Leninism, where it believes in establishing a one-party transitional state between capitalism and communism, as well as almost complete state ownership of the economy. Stalin ran the economy in a planned corporatist manner, albeit with almost completely full public ownership of all industries. He was also known for rapidly industrializing the Soviet Union, which led to the deaths of millions of people. He also believed in the idea of a cult of personality, which is where a single person has essentially a cult formed around them specifically, with him being seen as much more than a politician and more of a cultural and political icon, where similar to Hitler, he was seen as the savior of the nation. Also similar to Hitler, Stalin instituted certain anti-Semitic policies aimed at Jews, and was more broadly against religion as a whole, but specifically against Jews. His policy of nationalization was also much different from how it's usually carried out. Ordinarily, when a certain business or service is nationalized, the people who owned that business are usually compensated financially, or they're offered an opportunity to continue working in that business or service as an employee of the government. But in Stalin's case, most of the people who formerly owned land or businesses were either forcefully deported, murdered, or thrown in prison, meaning a lot of middle-class professionals who ran these businesses were no longer running them. And that's often seen as the main reason why a lot of these industrialization methods and agricultural reforms ended up leading to the deaths of so many people. The Stalin regime also took part in ethnic cleansing, the most infamous being the Holodomor, which was a man-made famine targeted at killing Ukrainians. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union also became a totalitarian state, even more so than it already was, where much like Nazi Germany, those who were against the state would be killed or imprisoned, or shipped off to enforced labor camps. In terms of the estimated death toll, numbers vary, but if we go off figures based on the famines that were caused at the time, as well as state executions and people dying in gulags, the low-end estimates tend to hover around 10 million deaths, and the high-end estimates tend to go above 20 million deaths, but we will probably never really know the exact number, unlike Nazi Germany where we pretty confidently know it's between 16 and 17 million deaths caused by the Holocaust, which doesn't include deaths during combat. We don't exactly have the documentation that tells us how many people died during the Soviet Union. Nazis treated murder as if it was paperwork, in the sense that they would write down pretty much everything they did. It's why most academics agree that 6 million Jews were killed, because the Nazis pretty much admitted it themselves. But the Soviet Union is shrouded in a lot more secrecy, and a lot of the deaths caused were either accidental or done in the spur of the moment and not written down somewhere. Like Stalin would just suddenly say, hey, we need to wipe out this group of people, then a bunch of soldiers would go over there and kill them all, and then they'd just move on to the next thing. And obviously I'm vastly oversimplifying how it worked, but that should give you an idea as to why there are so many wildly varying estimates on the death toll. Regardless of the specifics though, all you really need to know is that millions of people were deliberately killed under Stalin, and because of this, by and large, he's a fairly controversial figure within communism, with most communist ideologies being flat out anti-Stalin, although there are a few orthodox groups within communism that still believe in Stalinism, although as Stalinism would sort of die out, it would instead be usurped by Maoism. Maoism, or Mao Zedong thought as it's known officially, is the term used to describe the philosophical and political beliefs of Mao Zedong, who was the paramount leader of the People's Republic of China from 1949 to his death in 1976. Maoism is very similar to Stalinism in the sense that it's an extremist version of the Marxist-Leninist line, except Maoism is in some ways even more revolutionary and extreme than Stalinism. After Stalin's death in 1953 and Nikita Khrushchev's efforts to assert control over the Communist Party, Khrushchev criticized elements of Stalinism and attempted to shift the Soviet Union away from that form of communism. This, however, caused a split between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, as Mao Zedong believed in keeping as strict to the line of Stalinism as possible, and was against many of the reforms that Khrushchev put in place. Similar to Stalin, Mao carried out mass nationalization of all industries, and similarly dealt with landlords and former business owners in a similar way. Also similar to Stalin, he targeted people who were against the communist regime. There was the anti-rightist campaign, which lasted from 1957 to 1959, and the Cultural Revolution, which started in 1966 and ended in 1976 with his death. Both movements targeted pretty much anybody who was critical of the government, with both people on the political left and right wing being targeted. Religion was even more of a target than under Stalin, and specifically numerous local faiths that were popular throughout rural China were targeted, as well as more notable faiths like Buddhism and Confucianism. Numerous religiously significant historical buildings were destroyed. There was also the Great Leap Forward, which was a series of economic reforms that wanted to industrialize China, and this went very similar to how it did under Stalin, where the nationalized industries weren't run very effectively. Standards set for workers to reach were considered way too high and unachievable. The conditions for workers were also considered poor, and similar to what happened in the Soviet Union, it led to the deaths of millions of people. Just like in the Soviet Union, these reforms were seen as necessary in order to educate and industrialize the country, with a lot of these reforms on the outside seeming very successful. Specifically, literacy rates rose dramatically, but in terms of industrialization, China was still lagging behind most other powers, and wouldn't really elevate to an international power until another ideology, which I'm going to discuss next. In terms of the death toll, just like with the Soviet Union, we don't have the precise numbers, but people roughly estimate that it's between 40 million and 80 million deaths, and with the population of China at the time in mind, that is probably accurate. Despite this though, Mao still has a pretty strong cult of personality surrounding him, and even within contemporary Chinese society, he is pretty well respected, in comparison to the Soviet Union, which even itself decided to admit that Stalin wasn't the greatest leader of all time. But China nowadays has transitioned quite a bit from Maoism, and has embraced what it calls socialism with Chinese characteristics. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is the official ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, and basically advocates for a communist system with certain reservations, specifically with ones that it sees would better suit the Chinese public. This shift in communist policy began with Deng Xiaoping, who after a power struggle succeeded Mao after his death. Deng Xiaoping largely kept Chinese society the same, with the same totalitarian state and repressive policies, but began opening up the country to foreign investment, as well as introducing market elements into the various state-owned companies in order to increase productivity. Chinese socialism essentially changes with whoever the head of the Communist Party is. Like under Deng Xiaoping, it was very much Maoism with certain market characteristics. Jiang Zemin took the market reforms even further, and expanded private ownership and private enterprise from overseas, with further deregulation taking place as well. Under the next paramount leader of China though, Hu Jintao in 2002, some of these deregulations would be reversed, but China would continue to seek foreign investments. Under the current leader of China, Xi Jinping, the country has shifted more towards Deng Xiaoping, but is now more generally in favor of traditional Chinese culture. All of these reforms, though, were mostly economic, with China remaining a totalitarian state and many ethnic minorities and religious minorities still being persecuted to this day, and state censorship remaining firmly in place. As you can probably tell, socialism with Chinese characteristics is a very flexible term, and it changes depending on who's the paramount leader of China at any time. But at its core, it's essentially an authoritarian government with a market socialist economy. Market socialism. If social democracy is taking a capitalist system and inserting certain elements of socialism, then market socialism is taking a socialist system and inserting certain elements of capitalism. Say the most obvious example of a market socialist country is probably China, like I've talked about before, although minus the authoritarian stuff, I'm talking purely economically. Where in China, although most of the businesses are either state-owned or part-owned by the state, they're still mostly ran for profit and in a pretty traditional private enterprise kind of way. They aren't run in a communal communist kind of way, and they aren't run in a planned economic corporatist kind of way. And if you didn't know that the companies were state-owned beforehand, you probably wouldn't be able to tell on your own. So yeah, just to reiterate, market socialism is essentially just a socialist system with certain capitalist or market elements. Libertarian socialism. Libertarian socialism is a pretty interesting one to talk about because it's an ideology that both rejects state ownership of the means of production as well as private ownership, and advocates for what it calls workers' self-management, which is basically like the thing we talked about earlier with cooperatives, but something like that throughout the whole of society. And rather than these industries being owned by an elected state, they're owned purely by the workers themselves, but still not in a private property kind of way. There's just the community's property. So it's this very unique blending of anarchism and traditional socialism, so I would encourage you to look into it yourself if you find it interesting. But yeah, it is essentially just a more anarchist-minded version of socialism. Social libertarianism. Social libertarianism is an interesting ideology to talk about because it's one that's debated as to whether it's a liberal ideology or a left-wing ideology. And mainly that's because of its unique combination of certain policies from both the left and the liberal wing of politics, with it believing in a free market economy and private ownership, but also believing in a strong welfare state, and in some cases even supporting universal basic income, which if you don't know, universal basic income is basically the idea of giving everybody a set wage regardless of their job. So even if you're unemployed, you will have a set basic minimum wage that gets paid to you. But back onto social libertarianism specifically, it doesn't necessarily fit into either camp of liberal or left-wing ideology, because although it supports a strong welfare state like left-wing ideologies, it being firmly in the column of private ownership and free market ideals puts it at odds with that. And although it does support free market capitalism and heavily promotes private ownership, support of a large welfare state and a social security net puts it at odds with some of the liberal ideologies. But if you want to simplify it even further, you could say that social libertarianism is social liberalism with a bigger welfare state, or social democracy with less regulation and more private ownership. Georgism. Georgism is a name given to the political beliefs of Henry George, and Georgism essentially advocates for the idea of a single tax based on land value, as well as more broadly free trade and a free market economy. But what exactly is a land value tax? Well, essentially it would tax land based on its value, which, should be obvious. But what that means is basically taxes would be higher on land that goes unused, and this is mainly done to combat land hoarding, which is the practice of buying land and then waiting for the price of that land to rise, which means it could go years without being used for anything. And what a land value tax would do essentially is to force landowners into developing the land into something useful. When it comes to something like housing, for example, the land tax would force landlords to build more housing because they wouldn't want to be taxed on the empty land, and this would in theory increase the amount of houses in supply and then reduce costs for that housing. But Georgism doesn't just advocate for a land value tax, since anybody can just go ahead and support a land value tax if they want. It specifically advocates for that to be the only tax, or at the very least the overwhelming amount of income that comes through tax should be through the land value tax. And like I said previously, it bundles this together with free market and free trade policies. So Georgism is a very unique one and very similar to social libertarianism in my view, in that it is something that could be considered socialist and liberal at the same time. Like the idea of introducing a tax targeted at the wealthy in order to develop more land for the poor is definitely a socialist leaning idea, but then advocating for that to be the only tax on top of the free trade and free market ideas is very much a liberal idea. So this is another ideology that could really apply to either camp, and because of that it has a pretty broad base of support. Trotskyism. Trotskyism is the term used to describe the political thoughts and beliefs of Leon Trotsky, who was a major player during the Russian Revolution and generally considered to be Lenin's successor. But after being outmaneuvered by Stalin for the leadership, he was eventually exiled out of the Soviet Union, and then a few years after that, eventually assassinated. Trotsky was very much a Marxist-Leninist, believing in the establishment of a one-party state in order to transition to a communist society. Although unlike Stalin, he was generally speaking much more adamant about the transition happening as quickly as possible. Now, he was still authoritarian and totalitarian, believing in that one-party state for a period of time, but he saw this as the ends justifying the means in order to achieve a communist society. The two also differed in terms of foreign policy. This isn't something I talked about with Stalin because I wanted to save it for talking about it here, but before World War II, he generally speaking believed in the idea of socialism in one country, which was the idea that the Soviet Union should consolidate its power in isolation rather than try to go out and supply communist insurgents globally. And this differed drastically from Leon Trotsky, who believed in the permanent revolution, which is the idea that the Soviet Union should intervene as much as possible in order to ensure a communist revolution globally. The differences between the two would eventually lead to Trotsky's death, but with his death he sort of became a martyr for the communist movement, specifically the anti-Stalinist crowd within communism, and Trotskyist ideology would go on to influence many communist movements throughout the world. And even to this day, Trotskyism remains an important part of the communist movement. National Bolshevism. Now, I was considering putting this one further down the iceberg, but I think in recent years it started becoming more and more prominent. Not necessarily in actual politics, but more so just in online culture. And it also links to a larger movement that I want to talk about as well in this entry. But just starting off with the basics, what is National Bolshevism? It's basically the idea of combining elements of ultra-nationalism and communism, with the Bolsheviks being the name of the faction that Vladimir Lenin was a part of, and the one that eventually took control of Soviet Russia. National Bolshevism is unique because it's both on the far left of the spectrum economically and the far right of the spectrum culturally. And it spawned from this phenomenon known as Soviet nostalgia, or more broadly, communist nostalgia. It's prominent in all the former communist states in Eastern Europe, and it's basically a feeling of nostalgia and admiration for when the country used to be communist. And interestingly, it isn't necessarily just limited to approving of the politics and the economics of the time, and can just be an admiration for the aesthetics of being in those communist countries at that time. And in part, I think that's because of how quickly the countries transitioned away from that system. And for some people, I imagine it would have been quite a bit of whiplash to suddenly transition to a free market Western neoliberal economy when you'd spent your life under this Soviet system. But back to National Bolshevism specifically, it's essentially the most extreme wing of this movement. And I'm not even sure if that popularity surrounding it is purely ironic or not, since the idea of combining Nazism and communism is a pretty outlandish, memey idea, but I'm sure there is some unironic adherence towards it. And I guess we'll just wait and see how prominent it becomes in the following years. Syndicalism. Syndicalism is another one that I was thinking of putting lower down on the iceberg, but just like with National Bolshevism, it has in recent years become popular within online culture, and specifically Syndicalism really started getting popular with the mod Kaiserreich, which is a mod for the game Hearts of Iron 4. And Syndicalism is basically the idea of transitioning society to a bunch of worker collectives, specifically ones owned and ran by trade unions, or workers' syndicates in this case, but there would still be a central government made up of trade unionists who would make certain decisions on matters, but there would be a certain level of autonomy for each of these worker-owned syndicates. There's also a variant on syndicalism called anarcho-syndicalism, which is basically just a syndicalist system without the central government, where each of the worker-owned syndicates are pretty independent and autonomous. Syndicalism was probably most popular in the early 1900s, but after the First World War, governments started cracking down on syndicalist activities, and in time it started getting usurped by either more moderate or more revolutionary ideologies. But ever since the Kaiserreich mod, it has started gaining a little bit of prominence again, albeit as of right now mostly just in online circles. Showa statism. Showa statism was an ideology that came to prominence in Japan in the aftermath of World War I, and essentially became the main state ideology of the country from the 1930s to the end of World War II. Showa statism was an ultra-nationalistic far-right and imperialist ideology which attempted to establish a Japanese empire across East Asia. Showa statism also declared that the emperor of the country was a divine being, and that they should essentially rule the country as an absolute monarch, although in practice the military ended up ruling the country for the most part. Showa statism was a Japanese ultra-nationalist ideology, and essentially believed that the Japanese were the superior East Asian race and that they would unite the rest of the continent. Now, with an ideology as ultra-nationalistic and militaristic as this one, it was inevitable that war was going to happen, and this would eventually lead to the Second Sino-Japanese War, and then eventually World War II. Showa statism as an ideology is probably most associated with the numerous war crimes that Japan committed in World War II, with Showa statism effectively giving these soldiers free reign to do what they wanted to because they were the superior beings in their own eyes, and that they were quite literally serving a divine god for a greater purpose. This led to some of the worst atrocities ever committed in human history, and just like with the Nazis, not only were there mass killings of civilians, but there were also women being forced into sex slavery, children being tortured and murdered, and lethal human experimentation taking place in numerous secret compounds. In terms of the number of deaths, we don't really have a specific number. Just like what I said with Stalin earlier, unlike the Nazis who kept a record of almost everything they did, the Japanese didn't do that as much, and because of that none of these numbers are concrete, but the most accepted estimates tend to vary between 10 and 30 million, and this only refers to non-combatants or prisoners of war. However, there are certain more conservative elements of Japanese society that tried to deny that these war crimes happened, or at least tried to minimize the amount of damage that they did. The most prominent example probably being the previous Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, with him questioning the numbers of deaths and him denying that the Japanese military forced women into sex slavery. Despite this concerningly large conservative movement within Japanese society that denies these war crimes, overall Japan has completely rejected Showa statism, and even though the emperor still remains in power, it's almost completely a ceremonial role, and a few prime ministers have made an effort to try and mend ties with those affected by the genocide. Ba'athism. Ba'athism is a sub-ideology within the Arab socialist movement which specifically advocates for a one-party state to be established, as well as more generally pursuing Arab unity in a more aggressive way. Unlike Arab socialism, which isn't inherently authoritarian or aggressive, Ba'athism advocates for a specific level of authoritarianism to be introduced in order to achieve an Arab state, and is generally considered more corporatist and nationalist than regular Arab socialism. Though considering itself an Arab socialist ideology, there is a lot of debate as to whether or not it's fascist, the main sort of points of contention being the militarism, authoritarianism, and corporatist economy, as well as the generally more nationalistic and conservative approach to social issues. So I don't think it's controversial for me to say that Ba'athism is essentially just a form of Arab fascism. Juche. Juche is the official state ideology of North Korea, and although I did say previously that Stalinism and Maoism were probably the most extreme forms of Marxist-Leninism, Juche is the most extreme version of that. Whereas Stalinism and Maoism gave their respective leaders far-reaching powers to do what they wanted to, they were still somewhat limited by the party, and if necessary they could be removed. But under Juche, the supreme leader of the country has supreme authority over everything, and they are literally considered something other than human, and quite literally sent from above. Juche is also radically nationalist, militarist, and isolationist, and although not in theory monarchistic, it has in practice become that, with every major leader of North Korea being a descendant of the original founder Kim Il-sung. And because of this, much like Ba'athism, there is a lot of debate as to whether or not this is actually a communist ideology, or even a Marxist-Leninist ideology, since it is so focused on militarism and ultra-nationalism that it could be considered a fascist ideology, and the authoritarian monarchist elements also kind of lean towards that. So this is another one where it's kind of hard to classify what it is exactly. I would highly encourage you to read into it more just because it is fascinatingly strange. The social credit movement. Now, I think when most people think of social credit, they think of the system in China, which is a system that affects what services you can use and what jobs you can be employed in depending on your social credit score. But I'm not talking about that in this entry. The social credit movement that I'm talking about developed after the Great Depression and advocated for the implementation of a universal basic income system, where everybody in the country is given a set wage regardless of their employment status, with the hopes that that wage will allow them to spend money in the economy, as well as keep people afloat during unemployment. The social credit movement was most popular in Canada, with the Social Credit Party having at least one seat in Parliament from 1935 to 1980. Despite what you'd probably expect from the social credit movement, it wasn't a left-wing movement, and it found a lot of its support base in working-class voters who were skeptical of socialist or left-wing ideas, but were still somewhat against the conservative and capitalist establishment. And because of the support base of rural working-class workers, the social credit movement ended up adopting a lot of socially conservative stances, and transitioned into a broadly right-wing populist movement, where it would campaign to the left on economic matters, but to the right on social issues. Although with the rise of neoliberal economics in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the social credit movement largely began to die out. But like I said previously, it has sort of revived itself in the form of universal basic income, although it still has yet to be seen if a social credit system or universal basic income system will ever be introduced at some point. But I suppose we'll just wait and see. The Burmese Road to Socialism. The Burmese Road to Socialism was the official ideology of the one-party state in Burma from 1962 to 1988, in which the Burma Socialist Program Party ran the country as a one-party state, although it was essentially just ran by the military. The Burmese way to socialism was essentially an isolationist, anti-Western and Burmese nationalist political movement, and sought to vastly expand the powers of the state and the military, as well as more generally eliminate any Western influence in Burmese society. This was done by banning Burmese citizens from traveling to Western countries, restricting the teaching of the English language, nationalizing foreign-owned companies, and more generally promoting this united Burmese identity. This then led to state-sponsored campaigns against the Indian and Chinese minorities within Burma, with Indian and Chinese businesses being nationalized and given to the Burmese, and with the police and state more generally turning a blind eye to the ethnic violence being done against the Indians and Chinese within Burma. Although healthcare and education standards improved under the Burmese road to socialism, it had one of the weakest growth rates of GDP throughout all of East Asia, and the black market became a serious issue for the country, with as much as 80% of the national economy being represented by the black market. Additionally, there were also issues with inflation, as well as economic inequality. Certain reforms were made over the years in order to try and mitigate these negative effects, and this achieved some success, but one of these reforms in particular quite literally led to the end of the government, when leader of the country Ne Win wanted to make the currency divisible by the number 9, because he considered the number 9 lucky. But this initiative inadvertently wiped out millions of dollars of savings, and essentially bankrupted a large amount of the Burmese population, and was considered one of the major factors in the eventual overthrow of the government. The Burmese road to socialism is another one of these socialist in name only kind of ideologies, because although it does support nationalization of industries and certain elements of a welfare state, its ethnic nationalism, its focus on militarism, and its failures to combat economic inequality put it at odds with socialism as an ideology. And I think more broadly it's generally seen as a fascist ideology. National syndicalism. National syndicalism is basically just syndicalism like we talked about before, where you have worker-owned cooperatives outside of a capitalist system. But under national syndicalism, there would be certain elements of nationalism and theocracy introduced into that system. Now, it is a topic of debate as to how that would be implemented, but largely it's just the idea of syndicalism being motivated by a nationalist and theocratic ideology, and the idea that these cooperatives would be ran with a certain level of conservative social beliefs, as well as religious doctrine. But yeah, as a very basic, broad overview, it's essentially just a more conservative, nationalist-leaning form of syndicalism. Titoism. Titoism is the term used to describe the political philosophy and ideology of Josip Tito, who led the nation of Yugoslavia from 1944 to his death in 1980. He ruled the country under a one-party Marxist-Leninist state, but unlike every other Marxist-Leninist state in Europe, it wasn't associated with the Soviet Union, and championed the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, which sought to reduce the influence of America and the Soviet Union on the global stage. In terms of economics, Titoism is in support of a market socialist system, in which smaller private businesses are permitted to operate within the economy, but a majority of the economy is still state-owned or worker-owned, with Titoism also being in support of workplace democracy and cooperatives. Titoism is also a Yugoslavian nationalist ideology, which is essentially just support of Yugoslavia as a nation, which if you don't know, Yugoslavia was a nation that encompassed modern-day Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. This meant that many independence movements were violently repressed, and there was a certain level of economic inequality when it came to some of the minority groups within Yugoslavia, with them often being underrepresented and overshadowed by the larger ethnicities. But by and large, Titoism is essentially this: support of a one-party state, the support of a market socialist economy with worker cooperatives, the support of an independent non-aligned foreign policy, and support for a united Yugoslavian nation. Eurocommunism. Eurocommunism is a strain of communism that originated in Europe, and is a rejection of the Soviet Union's policies, as well as its influence over numerous Marxist and communist movements. Eurocommunism was most prominent in Italy and France, with both of their respective communist parties being fairly popular throughout the country. The main distinction between Eurocommunism and the regular Soviet communism is the fact that Eurocommunists accept and embrace democracy, whereas most other Marxist-Leninist ideologies tend to favor a one-party state. This is largely why a lot of these communist parties were electorally successful, since their acceptance of multi-party democracy made them a lot more palatable to the general public. Although even these reforms didn't really stop the downfall of the movement into the 90s and 2000s, and by and large Eurocommunism is a movement that's kind of died out. Peronism. Peronism is the term used to describe the political thoughts and beliefs of Juan Perón, who was president of Argentina from 1946 to 1955, and then again briefly from 1973 to 1974. Peronism is arguably the most dominant ideology in Argentina, and has such a broad range of appeal that it is both embraced by people on the right wing and the left wing, with nobody quite sure exactly where it sits on the political spectrum. But let's try and figure out what exactly it is. Juan Perón's term as president of Argentina was known for its numerous reforms in terms of welfare and labor, with the rights of workers expanded, state-owned companies being established, and a welfare state being established within Argentina, as well as an overall increase in economic intervention and regulation. During his second term as president, though, from 1952 to 1955, he began to turn away from this economic approach and embrace social liberalism, with a reduction in overall spending and some of the welfare and labor reforms being reverted, with this being done in order to reduce the government's deficit. The measures introduced did reduce the government's deficit, but they also led to wage stagnation, which angered labor unions and threw Perón's leadership into question. This, on top of his growing authoritarianism, his attempts to create a cult of personality surrounding him and his wife, his forcing of public servants to join his political party, as well as the disappearance of numerous opposition figures, would eventually lead to a military coup in 1955, with Perón himself being exiled from the country. Over the next 18 years, Argentina would cycle through a number of military governments and a number of short-lived democratically elected ones, and the economy would begin to gradually get worse and worse as the years went on, until elections were eventually called and a Peronist political candidate would win them. He would then reverse the ban against Perón being allowed to live in the country, and would subsequently call a general election a few months afterwards in order to allow Perón to run for the presidency. Perón would go on to win the 1973 election, but shortly after becoming president, he would eventually die in 1974, and his wife Isabel Perón would succeed him as president. Under her reign, though, numerous civil conflicts would begin to break out, and this would negatively impact the economy, with the military eventually leading a military coup against her and establishing a military dictatorship, and one that would last from 1976 to 1983, before democracy was once again re-established. Despite Peronism being primarily influenced by left-wing economic thinking, it would become embraced by certain elements of right-wing politics because of its social conservatism and nationalism, as well as certain people arguing that under Perón a corporatist system was introduced, much like one under fascism, and that this, in combination with his firmly anti-communist stance, would make him a right-wing populist figure. It's also important to note his history with fascism, and specifically how after the end of World War II, Argentina was infamous for allowing a great number of war criminals to enter into the country, and essentially allowing them to live there free from persecution. So it's safe to say that Peronism has a fairly controversial and broad history, and it has numerous different factors that are still influential in Argentina today. The two most notable spin-offs of Peronism, though, are probably Federal Peronism and Kirchnerism, with Federal Peronism being the ideology of Carlos Menem, who was president of Argentina from 1989 to 1999, and was known for introducing numerous neoliberal economic ideas into Argentina, with him essentially representing the right wing of the Peronist movement, and then Kirchnerism, which is named after Nestor and Cristina Kirchner, who much like the Perons were a husband and wife political duo, with Nestor Kirchner ruling the country from 2003 to 2007, and Cristina Kirchner ruling the country from 2007 to 2015. Both of them are considered the main figureheads behind the left-wing Peronist movement, and tend to focus on Perón's economic policy over his social policy, and are generally more progressive on social issues. As you can probably tell, Peronism is a pretty big and broad movement, but if I had to sum up the original conceit of Peronism, I'd say that it's a socially conservative social democratic ideology with authoritarian leanings. Pinochetism. Pinochetism is the term used to describe the thoughts and political beliefs of Augusto Pinochet, who was the de facto leader of Chile from 1973 to 1990, with him coming to power thanks to a US-backed coup against a democratically elected socialist government. Pinochet was a unique combination of totalitarianism and free market ideals, with his reign essentially being an authoritarian, conservative, capitalist one, with very few regulations and very low taxes, as well as the privatization of social security and numerous state-owned industries. The regime did, however, regulate the press, and was still pretty totalitarian outside of matters relating to the economy, with political leftists and their families being the main targets of the regime, with thousands upon thousands killed and tens of thousands tortured. Journalists and student activists were also targeted, with the death of 21-year-old American photographer Rodrigo Rojas being particularly infamous, where he was reportedly beaten and then doused with gasoline and set on fire, alongside a student named Carmen Quintana, who's actually still alive to this day and corroborated the story. The Pinochet regime was also infamous for what's called death flights, which is a form of execution where someone is thrown out of an airplane or helicopter, with 120 civilians being confirmed to have been killed this way, but the true number will likely never be known. On top of this, economic inequality became a serious issue for the country, with the wealthiest 10% of the country seeing their income rise by 83% over the course of the Pinochet regime, with an estimated 40 to 50% of the Chilean population being below the poverty line. These internal issues, as well as growing international pressure, would eventually culminate in a referendum on Pinochet's presidency in 1988, with 56% of the population voting in favor of moving away from Pinochet's regime. After the defeat, Pinochet did briefly attempt to coup the government once again, but at this point the military and the police had turned against him and decided to follow through with the calls for democracy. And in 1989, presidential elections were once again held. After his presidency, Pinochet mostly stayed quiet on political matters, although he did often visit the UK because of his good relations with the Margaret Thatcher government, because of his support for Britain during the Falklands War, and because him and Margaret Thatcher shared similar views on economics, with Thatcher effectively vouching for his stay within the country. And even when Thatcher was replaced by John Major, her influence allowed for him to stay within the country uninterrupted. Pinochet wouldn't face any charges for his crimes against humanity until 1998, where he was placed under house arrest at the Wentworth Club, and after 2 years of house arrest, he was eventually released in March of 2000 on medical grounds, with new Labour Home Secretary Jack Straw overruling the House of Lords, who wished to see him extradited to Spain. On his return to Chile, he was given the status of ex-president, which gave him immunity against all prosecution, as well as a generous financial allowance. Despite this though, in 2004, the Supreme Court of Chile would charge him with several crimes, and he was once again placed under house arrest, although after 2 years of house arrest, he would eventually die at the age of 91 in 2006. Pinochet left a fairly complicated political legacy, but for the most part he has been denounced by the Chilean government, but within some of the more extreme circles of Chilean politics he is still admired somewhat. Ithiadism. Now, I've probably said that completely fucking wrong, but I have absolutely no idea how to say this, so we'll just carry on. Ithiadism was the official ideology of the Committee for Union and Progress in Turkey, which assumed control of the Ottoman Empire during the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, and continued to lead the country up until the end of World War I. They were inspired by the Meiji Restoration and believed that they were the ones who could save the Ottoman Empire from collapse. And specifically, they wanted to emulate how Japan managed to transition to a modern industrial power, while still maintaining many of its cultural traditions. And in order to do this, they embraced many elements of what would become fascism, with a corporatist economy, rampant militarism, and the belief in a united national identity, with their approach to achieving this national identity being to forcefully deport numerous minority groups out of the empire, with Greeks, Christians, and Jews being targeted, with around 300 to 700,000 people being killed, but most especially Armenians, with the Armenian genocide being one of the most infamous aspects of this period in Ottoman history, where it's estimated that between 800,000 and 1,200,000 Armenians were killed, primarily by having them march into deserts with the intention of them never coming back, although executions were still common if people tried to resist. To this day, though, the Turkish government still denies that the genocide happened, alongside Azerbaijan and Pakistan, with only 31 members at the United Nations officially recognizing the genocide as something that happened. Ithiadism itself would never govern Turkey again, but its ideas became undeniably influential, and would in some part go on to influence Kemalism. Kemalism is the term used to describe the thoughts and political beliefs of Turkish leader Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who was the de facto ruler of Turkey from 1920 to 1938, having successfully led Turkey during the Turkish War of Independence, when the Entente powers attempted to carve up Turkey in the aftermath of World War I. Kemal established the Republic of Turkey and is known as the founding father of the nation, and established the Republic with 6 fundamental principles in mind. Republicanism, which emphasized the importance of popular sovereignty and anti-monarchism, populism in a broad anti-elitist sense, laicism, which is basically an anti-theocratic secular ideology which fights against religious influence, reformism, which advocated for a progressive approach towards technology and culture, sovereignty, which advocated for an independent Turkey free of foreign influence, nationalism, which advocated for a broad civic nationalist Turkish identity, with laws stating that anybody born within Turkey is a Turk, and this would often lead to conflicts with certain minority groups like the Kurds and the Armenians, and statism, which essentially advocated advocated for an economy in which the state influences it, primarily in a social democratic sense. Much like with Peronism, like we talked about before, Kemalism has a very broad range of support, but generally speaking it's seen as a left-wing ideology, mostly because of its economic positions, as well as its support of a secular society, and it generally being more progressive on social issues, relative to the standards of the region it's in, of course. Although, like I said before about the whole nationalism angle, it's definitely controversial among certain left-wing groups within Turkey, but is by and large generally considered a social democratic center-left ideology, especially within modern Turkey when it has embraced democracy, since it was initially an authoritarian ideology but slowly transitioned into democracy in the 50s, and has stuck with that stance ever since. Pancasila. Pancasila is the official founding ideology of Indonesia, which was first introduced by the country's first independence-era president, Sukarno, who led the country from 1945 to 1967. He proclaimed that an independent Indonesia should follow these 5 basic principles: a broad Indonesian patriotism which can appeal to everybody within the country, an internationalist viewpoint that embraces justice and humanity, deliberative consensus which basically argues for a democracy in which ethnic dominance is absent, and where representatives of the different ethnicities have equal voting power, the establishing of a welfare state inspired by socialism, and a divine state that allows for religious freedom and practice. After Sukarno was overthrown in 1967 though, military leader Suharto took control of Indonesia, and ruled over the country for the next 32 years until democracy was once again established in 1998. Just to clarify, Sukarno was generally democratically elected, but in 1959 he assumed control of the country through emergency powers, and then when Suharto became leader of the country, he maintained these emergency powers until 1998. And during his 32-year reign, certain principles associated with the Pancasila began to change. Rather than a belief in a secular society as had been laid out in the original Pancasila, the new revisions claim that the Indonesian state should believe in the one and only God, and specific references to socialism and the welfare state were replaced with broader principles of justice and unity. And to this day, that is how the Pancasila remains. The Pancasila very much follows the patterns that we've been looking at before with Kemalism and Peronism, where pretty much every major Indonesian political movement or party claims to adhere to the Pancasila in some way, with some adhering more to the original document, and some adhering more to the current document. The Three Principles of the People. The Three Principles of the People, also known as Tridemism, is the political philosophy of the founder of the Republic of China, Sun Yat-sen, who remains a respected figure in both the Republic of China in Taiwan and the People's Republic of China on mainland China, where he's referred to as the forerunner of the revolution. The three principles that Sun Yat-sen set out are as follows: nationalism, and specifically a civic style of nationalism, with Sun Yat-sen believing in uniting the 5 major ethnic groups of China, mainly the Huns, Mongols, Tibetans, Manchus, and Muslims, under a single Chinese nation. The second principle was democracy, with Sun Yat-sen proclaiming that the people had 4 unalienable rights: the right to an election, the right to referendum, the right to recall a representative, and the right to initiate a petition. And the third and final principle was welfare, and it essentially advocated for a welfare state, a land value tax, and a more equal distribution of land. The three principles of the people became the main ideology of the Kuomintang, the most important and influential political party in China from its foundation in 1919 to its eventual expulsion from mainland China during the Chinese Civil War in 1949, where they would go on to rule Taiwan as a one-party state until democratization in 1987, where for a majority of its rule it would govern as a quasi-fascist state, but would gradually transition to a more moderate form of conservatism as democratization began. The right-wing shift that occurred within Tridemism is largely attributed to this fear of socialist-adjacent ideologies, as the Kuomintang feared that if they allowed left-wing ideas to grow within Taiwan, it would eventually lead to another communist revolution. So for the most part, they ignored a lot of the more left-wing ideas that Sun Yat-sen had, and instead interpreted his ideas in a more broad nationalist sense. On mainland China, though, people weren't any more sympathetic to the left wing of Tridemism, with Chinese communists seeing it as not being radical enough, and then believing that left-wing Tridemists would try to undermine the revolution, or that they were secretly working for the Kuomintang, putting left-wing Tridemists in a very awkward position, being considered too radical for Taiwan, and not radical enough for mainland China. Despite this though, the broad strokes of the Three People's Principles and what Sun Yat-sen stood for overall are still widely admired, although this is generally considered to be a right-wing ideology nowadays, mostly because of its association with the deeply conservative, authoritarian, and anti-socialist one-party state in Taiwan. But still to this day, both China and Taiwan claim to be the legitimate successors to the Three People's Principles, and especially in Taiwan, it still remains a fairly influential ideology. Nasserism. Nasserism describes the political thoughts and beliefs of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was president of Egypt from 1956 until 1970. Nasser was a member of the Free Officers Movement, which was essentially a political alliance of reform-minded and anti-imperialist officers, whose stated goal was to make Egypt as independent as possible. And in 1952, an opportunity for the Free Officers to come to power arose. In that year, the fortunes of the incumbent government began to change, with the British launching an attack on a police station in the city of Ismailia in response to growing attacks against the British-owned Suez Company by Egyptian guerrilla forces, with the ensuing attack on the police station leading to the deaths of 50 Egyptian police officers. These deaths then caused riots to break out across the capital city of Cairo, and during these riots, a fire broke out, killing an additional 76 people. In the middle of the chaos and the civil unrest, the Free Officers saw their chance to assume control of the country, with them overthrowing the incumbent government and placing Mohammed Naguib as leader of the country, with Mohammed Naguib being a respected general within the Egyptian military. And shortly after their ascension to power in 1953, they declared Egypt a republic, with Naguib as its first president. In the early years of the regime, the military worked alongside politicians, with many from the previous government still staying on in certain positions. But as the military and the old government began to clash more on economic reforms, the Free Officers slowly pushed them out of government and began to assume complete control, and established the Revolutionary Command Council, the main decision-making body of the government, made up entirely of military officials, with Naguib as its chairman and Nasser as the vice-chairman. Naguib and Nasser would disagree on some key issues, however, with Naguib opposing Nasser and the rest of the RCC's decision to ban political parties in former one-party states, and Naguib also becoming increasingly opposed to the socialist-inspired land reform measures undertaken by Nasser and the RCC. These continued disagreements led to him being replaced by Nasser and placed under house arrest in 1954, with Nasser then purging the RCC of any members loyal to Naguib. After this, Nasser would essentially become the de facto ruler of the country, although he didn't officially become the president until 1956. The early years of the Nasser regime were known for the nationalization of British-owned businesses, and specifically the Suez Canal, which angered the British and French because of its economic importance to trade. In response, they planned to invade Egypt and overthrow Nasser, but the United States and the Soviet Union, in a rare showing of solidarity, strongly opposed the idea and forced France and Britain to back down. This diplomatic humiliation for France and Britain skyrocketed Nasser's popularity, and this on top of the state propaganda made him one of the most popular leaders in the Middle East. On top of his successes internationally, his domestic economic reforms were met mostly positively, with the nationalization of foreign companies providing tens of thousands of decent-paying jobs which hadn't really been offered to lower-class Egyptians beforehand, with a lot of these better-paying jobs either being provided to the higher classes within Egypt or being taken on by foreign workers. In addition to this agricultural production increase, welfare programs were introduced, and Egypt began to industrialize quickly, becoming one of the more developed nations in the Middle East and Africa overall. Outside of these domestic reforms, Nasser pursued a policy of non-alignment on the international stage, with him neither allying or making enemies of the United States or the Soviet Union, and he also became the face of the Arab socialist movement, with him in the following years supporting numerous leftist governments across the Middle East, and more generally advocating for a united Arab world, which he actually did manage to partially achieve, when in 1958 Syria and Egypt merged into a new nation known as the United Arab Republic. This nation would be short-lived, however, with Nasser's attempts to implement similar socialist reforms in Syria not being nearly as popular, especially with the Syrian military elite, who also resented the amount of power that they lost due to the merger. This eventually led to a military revolt in 1961, which would prove successful as complete control of Syria was established in a few days. This would lead to Nasser withdrawing from Syria days later and recognizing Syrian independence. The collapse of the United Arab Republic weighed heavily on Nasser's mind and became a permanent source of regret and sadness, with his health beginning to deteriorate into the 1960s as he adopted a habit of smoking heavily. After the breaking down of the UAR, Nasser sought to further push his socialist and progressive reforms, with Egypt over the course of the 1960s adopting free healthcare, free education, a national minimum wage, a reduction in working hours, the adoption of mixed-gendered schools, more legal protections for women, and rapprochement with the previously oppressed Shia Muslims who had often been persecuted under the majority Sunni Muslim population of Egypt. These changes, however, were unpopular with more conservative elements of Egyptian society, leading to increased political unrest stemming primarily from radical Islamist groups, and the economy would also begin to stagnate near the end of the 1960s, with his removing of suspected political dissidents within government leading to less managers being able to run the economy, with a lot of people who had worked for the government and ran the economy in the 1950s 1950s and early 1960s now being gone. One of Nasser's bigger diplomatic failures, though, would come in 1967, with the outbreak of the Six-Day War, in which Israel attacked Egypt in retaliation against Nasser's banning of Israeli ships passing through the Strait of Tiran, which in and of itself was in response to growing tensions with Israel over the supposed breaking of agreements. That's a whole other story for another time. All you need to know is that Egypt was completely humiliated during this war, with an estimated 10 to 15,000 Egyptians killed, in comparison to Israel only suffering around 700 to 900 deaths. The humiliation led to a ceasefire being signed and the Sinai Peninsula being annexed by Israel until it was eventually returned in 1982. This defeat caused Nasser to announce his resignation as president a day after the ceasefire. Shortly after announcing his resignation, however, hundreds of thousands of supporters protested across Egypt and demanded that he remain the president. Nasser ended up being so moved by these demonstrations that a day after resigning he announced that he was reversing the decision and staying on as the president of Egypt. Despite the outpouring of support for Nasser, it was clear that some kind of reform was needed, as after 11 years of one-party rule, Egyptians were starting to get tired of it, with Nasser in response to these calls for reform appointing more civilians into government positions of power, and dismissing some of the old guard from the Revolutionary Command Council. In addition, Nasser announced plans to reintroduce freedom of speech and numerous civil liberties, with many of these measures having been rescinded during Nasser's rule. However, the vast majority of these proposals would never see the light of day, with Nasser passing away from a heart attack on the 28th of September 1970. His state-sponsored funeral that traveled through the streets of Cairo was attended by more than 5 million people, and he was mourned across the Arab world. Nasserism wouldn't die alongside him though, as shortly after his death, Anwar Sadat assumed the presidency. Sadat, upon becoming president, however, purged numerous prominent Orthodox Nasserists from government in an unexpected power move. Sadat also attempted to retake the Egyptian lands lost during the 6 Days War, in what would become known as the Yom Kippur War, but this also ended in failure. And in the aftermath of this, Sadat would seek to expand ties with Israel, as well as more closely align with the United States, as opposed to Nasser's policy of non-alignment. These attempts to mend ties with Israel and the United States angered numerous Arab nations, and eventually Egypt was expelled from the Arab League in response to this in 1977. In terms of economic reforms, Sadat liberalized the economy by selling off certain state-owned industries and deregulating the economy. This was met largely negatively by the Egyptian public, and in 1977 mass riots broke out after companies began raising their prices due to the removal of the price limits that had been introduced under Nasser, with the price of bread in particular rising pretty high. Despite the domestic unrest, Sadat received significant financial support from the United States and fairly favorable trade agreements, which allowed the economy to stay afloat for a time being. However, by 1980 the economy began to falter, and Sadat began losing popularity even more. This all eventually culminated in his assassination on the 6th of October 1981, with Islamic extremists who disapproved of his reapproachment with Israel being responsible for his death. In the aftermath of the assassination, Vice President Hosni Mubarak became the president, and over the course of his reign began fully transitioning Egypt away from Nasserism, with him fully embracing conservative neoliberal policies, and him maintaining the authoritarian measures and not acting on the liberalizing reforms. And even to this day, Egypt remains under this post-Nasserist system, with all major attempts at reform or revolution being unsuccessful. And with Egypt having been this conservative neoliberal authoritarian regime a lot longer than it had been a Nasserist one. Now, to wrap up this incredibly long section of the video, Nasserism is essentially the blueprint for Arab socialism and Arab nationalism, and represents the most successful attempt to introduce this kind of system into an Arab society. But as of recording this video, no Arab nation has returned to this system of government as of yet, and we'll just have to wait and see how the Arab world develops in the following years. Mobutism. Mobutism is the term used to describe the political thoughts and beliefs of Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled the Democratic Republic of the Congo as president from 1965 to 1997, although under his rule the Democratic Republic of the Congo was known as Zaire. He came to power in a US-backed coup against the democratically elected left-wing candidate Patrice Lumumba. The Congo transitioned into a one-party state under the popular movement of the revolution. Mobutu wanted to transition the Congo to a more traditional African state, so he replaced the name Congo given to it by the Belgians with the name Zaire. He also began replacing Christianity with a religion of his own, which portrayed him as a divine being sent by God, and he also began the process of phasing out European culture, leading to the banning of Christian names, the banning of Western-style fashion and suits, and more of an isolationist approach to foreign policy. He also believed in the idea of Zaireanization, which was a pseudo-fascist ideology which attempted to create a national identity for the Zaire nation, leading to the state repression of certain tribalist and regionalist movements. This fascistic style style of doing things also expanded to economic matters, with the nationalization of industry and a heavy amount of state interference into the economy. However, these companies were often infested with corruption and performed incredibly poorly, and inflation became a massive issue, and numerous people within the government got rich off of state funds, all whilst the Zaire region was slipping behind the rest of Africa, with barely existent public infrastructure and starvation becoming a serious issue. Even the military began to enter into a state of anarchy, with a lack of stable wages and poor conditions in the barracks, leading to the military often going on raids and just attacking local villages and stealing supplies, with very little being done to punish this kind of behavior. Mobutu's regime became one of the most infamously and cartoonishly corrupt regimes in history, with Mobutu himself amassing a personal net worth of over $5 billion during his time as leader of Zaire. However, despite all this, he managed to stay in power for so long because of the support that he received from the United States, who saw him as a strong anti-communist ally. He also had a massive cult of personality, with portraits of him being hung in public places, government officials being forced to wear pins with his face on it, and the fact that he was officially referred to as the Messiah. However, despite all this, by the time that the Cold War began to wound down in the early 90s, support from the US began to wound down too, and internationally the regime began to be criticized more and more often. This culminated in an infamous incident in May of 1990 when numerous students began protesting his rule. But one night whilst they were sleeping at their campus, the electricity was cut off and the military was sent in with machetes and bayonets, with an estimated 290 students being brutally killed. This effectively marked the end of the regime. Western support for the Zaire regime, which had already begun wavering, completely plummeted, and all financial and diplomatic support that was given to the Zaire regime was cut off. Things would get even worse for the regime though after the Rwandan genocide, where Mobutu would allow numerous participants in the genocide to take refuge in Zaire. He also began forcing the Tutsis, who had been the victims of the Rwandan genocide, to leave Zaire. This proved to be a step too far for many, and in 1996, a coalition of African nations as well as local resistance groups began the process of overthrowing Mobutu, which would later become known as the First Congo War, which would lead to the deaths of 250,000 people in the space of 6 months. In the end though, Mobutu would be overthrown and exiled to Morocco, where he would die a few months after the war from prostate cancer. Despite Mobutu being overthrown, the Congo would remain in a state of anarchy for the foreseeable future, and numerous parts of the country de facto being independent. And it does seem like it's going to be a long road to recovery for the Congo. Mobutuism does still live on to some extent though, with Mobutu's son Nzanga Mobutu leading the Union of Mobutuist Democrats, which currently has 9 representatives in the Congo parliament. It's safe to say that due to the legacy of Mobutu, you aren't going to be seeing many Congolese politicians claiming they're living up to his legacy, and overall he's a leader that the Congo would prefer to forget. Third International Theory. Third International Theory was the official ideology of Libya under its leader Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi ruled the country from 1969 until 2011 after he was deposed and killed in the First Libyan Civil War. Third International Theory essentially tries to be an alternative to capitalism and Marxism-Leninism, and was a fusion of Ba'athism, African socialism, and Islamic socialism. And for the most part, during the early years of his reign, he stuck to this, although with a decidedly authoritarian and nationalistic twist to it, with most non-Arabs and especially Jews and Italians being treated harshly within the country. Most foreign-owned businesses were also nationalized, especially those from Western countries. And these nationalization endeavors did actually end up increasing the country's GDP, from 3.8 billion in 1969 to 13.7 billion in 1974, and then 24.5 billion in 1979, with the standard of living rising alongside this. Gaddafi also implemented certain elements of Sharia law, however, leading to the prohibition of alcohol, the shutting down of nightclubs and Christian churches, and Arabic being the only language allowed in official capacities. In the early years of his reign, he was very much inspired by Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt from 1954 to 1970, and one who had also introduced numerous progressive and socialist reforms into the country, although Nasser was slightly more progressive on social issues than Gaddafi was. What they did share in common though was an authoritarianism, although further into the mid-1970s Gaddafi began to embrace even more extreme forms of authoritarianism, and began shifting away from his Arab socialist roots. Persecution of political dissidents would escalate massively, he would begin funding numerous anti-Western groups across the world, Sharia law would become more prominent throughout daily life, although he was still unable to mend ties with Islamist leaders, with moderate Islamists thinking he was too extreme, and extremist Islamists thinking he wasn't extreme enough. His relationship with other Arab socialist and Ba'athist countries also began to deteriorate, with him becoming increasingly frustrated that the Arab nations began to compromise with Israel, as well as their rejection of his numerous proposals to unite the Arab nations, under his rule of course. In terms of economic policy though, he would still maintain a certain level of popularity, with his numerous socialist-leaning reforms improving the health and education of the country, and even the establishment of some worker-owned cooperatives, albeit strictly regulated and monitored. And I think this is what largely kept Gaddafi in power for so long. Despite his persecution of minorities, his shift towards African nationalism away from Arab nationalism just because he wasn't getting along with the Arabs, his numerous failed military interventions into Africa, his increasingly totalitarian and unpredictable rule, the insane cult of personality he tried to develop around himself, and even his creation of a chemical weapons program, the economy for the most part was stable. Libyans by and large, although definitely not completely satisfied, felt that their lives were better under Gaddafi than under any previous system. But that began to change as Libya entered into the 21st century, with Gaddafi becoming even more irrational, and numerous industries began to be privatized. Although certain socialist-leaning policies like free education, free healthcare, free housing, free water, and free electricity was still maintained. But even with these privatization methods, the fascistic state that Gaddafi had created was still very much in place, with no signs of political executions and arrests stopping anytime soon. This frustration at the lack of reforms and a worsening economy would eventually lead to widespread protests calling for democracy, and Gaddafi responding by ordering the killings of hundreds of protesters. This would essentially spark the Libyan civil war, and with it Gaddafi was overthrown and killed, ending his 42-year reign over the country. Now I know that was a very long section just to explain Third International Theory, but that is just because Gaddafi was such a complex and bizarre political figure, and because of that I did feel like I needed to go into a little bit more detail. But yeah, Third International Theory. A bizarre mix of fascism, African, Arab, and Islamic socialism, African and Arab nationalism, and really whatever else the hell Gaddafi decided it was going to be for that week. Fujimorism. Fujimorism is the term used to describe the thoughts and political beliefs of Alberto Fujimori, who served as president of Peru from 1990 to 2000. Fujimori ran for president in 1990 and managed to successfully win, although in 1992 he enacted emergency powers, dissolved the Peruvian parliament, and assumed control of the Peruvian military. Under his 10-year reign, Fujimori was known for his neoliberal economic policies, his control of state media, and his rampant persecution of political dissidents, with communists from the Shining Path guerrilla group, as well as journalists, political activists, and students being the primary targets. The most infamous of these repressive measures, though, was the National Population Program. On the surface, the program purely existed to address population issues, but in practice it was a government program specifically targeted at indigenous Peruvians, with the goal of forcefully sterilizing the indigenous population of Peru, with an estimated 300,000 indigenous Peruvians being forcefully sterilized during this time, with the end goal of essentially eliminating the rural population of Peru. Despite all of this, he still managed to stay in power up until the year 2000, when worsening economic conditions made him increasingly unpopular. This would lead to him fleeing the country and claiming asylum in Japan. He remained in this self-imposed exile until 2005 when he was arrested in Chile, and then extradited to Peru in 2007. He would remain in prison for an additional 2 years, and then in 2009 was charged with human rights violations and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was, however, released fairly recently in December of 2023. But even before then, his name had remained a prominent part of Peruvian politics, with his daughter Keiko Fujimori running in every presidential election since 2011, and every single time managing to average around 48 to 49% of the vote. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely moderated over the years. Like, I doubt his daughter is actively calling for the forced sterilization of indigenous people, and generally speaking it seemed to have transitioned into a more broadly right-wing populist ideology, albeit with intensely conservative social values and neoliberal economic values, and it seems like it's here to stay for the foreseeable future. Posadism. Posadism is the term used to describe the thoughts and political beliefs of Juan Posadas, who led the Latin American chapter of the Fourth International, which was essentially an international Trotskyist organization. Although very much being a Trotskyist, Posadas began to develop numerous fringe theories within the movement, and would soon become infamous for some of his strange beliefs. One of his most prominent ones was the idea that aliens had to believe in communism, and that only under a communist system could interplanetary travel be possible, as well as his belief that in order for communism to be achieved, a nuclear war would have to be started between the United States and USSR, and that in his view the world would rebuild again under a workers' revolution, leading to him very much being opposed to the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, as well as most other attempts to try and limit the nuclear arsenal. There's a lot more going on with this guy, but those are the two things that people point to, because they were very much considered fringe ideas even in the Trotskyist movement, and his whole belief system has very much become a meme in modern times. But regardless, it's still pretty interesting to read up on. English socialism. English socialism is the ideology of the INSOC party, the main party in George Orwell's novel 1984. It is a totalitarian ideology modeled off of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, and is essentially the most extreme version of totalitarianism, where the authority of the state is so solidified that contradictions become facts, with the motto of the regime being war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. Statements that are completely in contradiction of each other, but because the state says that it's right to say that, it becomes right. The figurehead of the INSOC regime is Big Brother, but in reality it's ruled by a small cabal of oligarchs. There is some debate surrounding what specifically 1984 is critiquing, and specifically what kind of ideology at the time was it really trying to aim this criticism towards, but I think purposely it's a pretty broad critique of totalitarianism and authoritarianism in general. Like, we can interpret that the economy is vaguely a corporatist one, very much in the style of fascism or Stalin's Russia, but I think the point of 1984 isn't necessarily to say that this is a one-to-one parody or satire of Stalinism or fascism, but to more broadly just be about how totalitarianism is bad. And even though the actual ideology of INSOC is English socialism, George Orwell himself was a democratic socialist who fought for the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War, so I highly doubt that this is some sort of elaborate criticism of socialism, like some people within right-wing politics tend to believe. There are other ideologies within the world of 1984 though, specifically neo-Bolshevism and death worship. We really don't know that much about either of these ideologies, so I can't really go into too much detail here, especially since nothing that the state says within 1984 should be taken as actually factual. Like, does death worship or neo-Bolshevism even exist, really? And for that matter, does the state actually own almost half the world, or is it literally just Britain that they own? That's what makes the book so interesting, so I don't think there's that much point elaborating on what these ideologies are exactly, since we don't actually know what they are, but it is kind of interesting to wonder what exactly death worship is, although from the name alone I can probably give it a guess. Fordism. Fordism is the ideology of the society within the Brave New World novel. In the novel, this society worships Henry Ford. Yes, the actual manufacturer of Ford cars. And in their society, there are 5 main classes: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon. Those born in the higher classes are genetically engineered, with increased attractiveness, tallness, and overall physical capabilities, whilst the people in the lower classes are kept at bay with drugs. And the entire lower class population is essentially hooked on these drugs. The main goal of the society is to increase consumption as much as possible, and in that sense it's a very market-focused ideology, with the hope that by drugging up the lower classes people will continue to consume, and thus empower the upper classes. It is a fairly radically progressive ideology on social issues though, with its rejection of traditional values and traditional lifestyles, with orgies being rampant, apparently. And what I've kind of gathered from reading certain elements of the book is this idea that it's a broad critique of liberalism, with it criticizing the consumerism and class dynamic of liberal economic policy, as well as what it believes to be socially liberal policies, with its talk of orgies and drug taking and the breaking down of traditional values. But then again, I am not as familiar with this book as I am with 1984, so I don't know as much about the different interpretations people have, but regardless, it's certainly an interesting read, regardless of what exactly it is trying to say. Hopianism. Hopianism is the term used to describe the thoughts and political beliefs of Hans Hermann Hope, or Hop, I don't know how that's pronounced, a German-American academic and economist with a fairly strange set of beliefs. Hopianism is both an anarcho-capitalist, socially conservative, and authoritarian ideology. Hopianism advocates for the nations of the world to decentralize and become numerous independent city-states, with these city-states run completely privately, with absolutely nothing being owned by the state. And because of this, he's against democracy as well, specifically because democratically elected representatives essentially exist to run the state, so that would mean democracy would contradict the idea of everything being privately owned. Oddly though, despite being generally against the state and government influence, he is against freedom of movement for immigrants, which is usually something that libertarians and anarcho-capitalists support, and he also believes that non-anarcho-capitalists should be excluded from society, in particular communists and those who support democracy. So yeah, you can probably see why this is so low down. I would have talked about it when I was talking about anarchism in the first layer, but this is such a strange set of contradictions and interesting belief systems that I just had to go into more detail here. But yeah, that is essentially Hopianism. It's very much controversial within the anarcho-capitalist and libertarian circles, and is very much on the political fringe of the movement. Anarcho-monarchism. Anarcho-monarchism, as the name implies, is this strange blending of monarchist and anarchist ideology, with it embracing a feudalist system like under monarchism, but the individual feudal lands would have a lot more autonomy than under a traditional monarchist system. Although unlike a traditional anarchist system, the monarchy would have some power over these little feudal lands, and from person to person the amount of power that should be permitted for the monarchy under this system varies. This is an ideology that is borderline a joke ideology. Like, there are definitely people who are genuine in their support of this, but just like with National Bolshevism, I think a lot of the support for this, especially online, comes from people finding it funny to combine two seemingly opposite things, because the idea of combining anarchism, which is about absolutely no authority and statelessness, and monarchy, which is about supreme authority of one person over everything, is kind of a memeable idea. But once again, there are people who genuinely seem to believe in this ideology, and some people have even interpreted that Tolkien was an anarcho-monarchist, although that might be a little bit of a stretch. Fourth political theory. Fourth political theory was created by Alexander Dugin in 2009, and essentially promotes an ideology that isn't based on individuality, collectivism, or nationality, but instead existence itself. Fourth theory claims that liberalism has defeated socialism and fascism in the ideological struggle, and that a new fourth alternative should be thought up in order to combat it. Fourth theory borrows numerous different elements of other ideologies, and is generally considered to be a conservative leaning on National Bolshevik ideology, with it essentially being opposed to the neoliberal economic model, as well as embracing traditionally conservative values. This one is a strange one and it's kind of hard to explain, but generally speaking it's seen as being part of the National Bolshevik movement, and it's more of a blending, and I completely understand that, so that's why this second channel now exists. Anyway, thank you so much. Outside of Russia and certain online circles, it hasn't really gained much traction at all. Illegalism. Illegalism is and I'll see you in the next video. Actually advocates for illegal things to be legal, and that we should all commit crime and join this anarchic, lawless society. This is another one which you might assume is just like an online joke ideology, but it does in fact have its origins in the late 1890s and early 1900s, as like a legitimate school of thought within the anarchist movement, albeit one which fizzled out and died very quickly. It still has some adherents though, and I guess you could say any sort of criminal is following illegalism, so in that sense it could be one of the most popular ideologies of all time. But as you can probably tell, this is an ideology that is very much on the political fringe, and not necessarily something to take 100% seriously. Accelerationism. Accelerationism is an ideology that proposes that capitalism should be accelerated as much as possible, with its attributes being as intensified as possible in order to eventually reach a technologically advanced society. It does, however, have a left-wing school of thought, which believes that by accelerating capitalism, it will eventually collapse, and that after this collapse of capitalism, socialism will eventually rise to take its place. Accelerationism has begun to change in terms of its definition, though, with a lot of neo-Nazis and right-wing extremist groups taking on the term, with them specifically advocating for the accelerating of racial conflicts until an eventual race war and then the establishment of a white ethno-state, which would essentially just be a state where it's only white people. I think it's easier to think of accelerationism more as a method of getting to a system rather than a system in and of itself, and in that sense it's basically just this idea of intensifying what you're doing as much as possible, all with the end goal of something eventually good coming from that. Do be careful about using the term though, because some people do associate it with the whole accelerating the race war into an ethno-state thing, but it is generally more of a broad term. Transhumanism. Transhumanism is basically an ideology that advocates for humans to become fused with technology, and I do mean that in the most literal sense of the term, so cyborgs, basically, with it believing that humanity's destiny lies with merging with its technology, and that combining humanity and technology with cybernetic enhancements can only bring good things. If you talked about this ideology like 20, 30 years ago, it would be complete fiction, but this has worryingly become something that people are starting to talk about now, and it wouldn't surprise me if in 10 years' time political parties are starting to talk about this a lot more and where exactly the line is, but it's definitely an interesting topic of discussion, and I think a lot of people can vary on how far they think this technological integration should go. And that being said, there is a lot of variation within the transhumanist movement, and where exactly the line should be drawn when it comes to this technological integration. And like I said, we should probably keep an eye on this ideology for when it becomes a lot bigger in the future. Fully automated luxury gay space communism. Finally. I've saved the best to last. Fully automated luxury gay space communism is essentially this idea that in a communist transhumanist society, gay rights would become something that is synonymous with society, and eventually this would lead to interplanetary exploration. It's less of a coherent ideology and more of just a concept, and it is mostly a joke, if you couldn't tell already, but it essentially just says that if we transition to a transhumanist, communist, pro-LGBT society, we would be able to travel to space, and that would be pretty cool. And yeah, that's the end of the video. This is the longest video I've ever had to do. And if you're unaware, I have another channel called Christian Cries, which you can check out as well, where I make videos on games and things like that. But this is the longest video I've ever had to do. And I'm not talking about running time because there are some that are longer on the other channel, but just in terms of the research and the editing of the video and everything like that. So I hope it turned out okay. Also, I want to reiterate again, like I said at the beginning, or like, you know, a little thing popped up at the beginning. As strange as it may seem, I am not omniscient. I don't know everything. I'm not all-seeing. I'm not always correct about certain things. So don't hold this video as like this everything in it is completely accurate and 100% how everybody interprets it. This is simply kind of an overview of specific ideologies to kind of get a basic idea as to what they are and, you know, what they kind of stand for. And this is really the first time I'm doing a video like this, so do let me know constructive criticisms and anything else like that. But what exactly this channel is going to focus on specifically is just really mostly just political or historical topics, stuff that I can't really fit into like a video game analysis on the other channel. Might talk about some alt history content or specific periods in political history that I find interesting, maybe breakdowns of certain key political figures, or pretty much just anything I want to talk about relating to politics or history. And the thing is, I would talk about this stuff on the main channel, you know, Christian Cries, but I think I want to separate the two just because it's good to have one channel that is mostly just like fun, kind of sometimes deep analysis of, you know, video games that I like and things I'm nostalgic for, and then another channel for more semi-serious discussions about politics, because I find both to be equally important in my life, and I don't want to not talk about one thing in order to just appeal to one kind of channel image. So I figured just having two channels where I can do both of these things that I find interesting and I enjoy making content about, but in a way that doesn't annoy people who just want one or the other. Like, I understand if I uploaded some of this political stuff to the main channel, then certain people who just want to see game reviews and things like that wouldn't really like that at all, and I completely understand that, so that's why this second channel now exists. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Give me any, you know, feedback on this, or, you know, any information that you have about any of these ideologies below, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.